Yeah, does this sound okay? Okay. So welcome, everybody. Good morning. This is one of the highlights of the year for us and a wonderful way to close out the coming end of the academic year to really celebrate our students. The Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, our priority is our undergraduate students, mentoring them, guiding them with research and creative projects. And that's what we're most committed to, essentially, and most proud of, amongst the many things that we do. So this is our 8th annual Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel Undergraduate Research Conference. And I know sometimes it's difficult for students to present their research to a public audience. And this is also being live streamed for students and families that weren't able to make it here, that they can watch from other states that they're living in, or if they couldn't make it this morning. And so we'll also have that on our website for people to view recordings, because we're proud of all the accomplishments of our students and want to celebrate that. So we're going to have 3 panels this morning, and then we're going to have a lunch, and our former student, Dr. Jeffrey Levin, who gave a wonderful talk on his newly published book yesterday evening, he will be giving some thoughts about minoring in Jewish studies. He was also an undergraduate here at James Madison College, talking a little bit about his career and developments, and then opening it up to advice, and then we'll just kind of have fun, talking together over lunch after that. But we also always want to connect our minors to our alumni as well. And so we have lots and lots of alumni that whatever your interests we can connect you to, but we always bring one in person for the Undergraduate Research Conference. So first up will be Aaron Parker, who will be talking about a research paper called Suffering in Silence, a case study of the Jewish Sonderkommando. And I think he did this under the guidance of Professor Amy Simon, who's our chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History at MSU. And she will then be a discussant for his paper, and we'll open it up to questions, comments from all of you after each paper, and then after each panel. So since this is the paper in this panel, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and comments on each panel. So thank you so much for being here to support our students. And Aaron, we'll hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today is a wonderful day. Oh, wait, well, there goes half of my script. But we're going to have a quick change in what my paper's name is. So, one second here. We got a freeze. Yep. See if I can find the button here. Freeze. Hello?
On the screen here is a little thing.
Oh. All right, sweet. Thank you. All right, so like I said, I do have a little bit of a change in my title. So it is still called Suffering in Silence, but it's more focused on the educational benefits of documentaries. So this is basically a study about the representations of the Holocaust. So what made me interested in this is that I was watching the documentary Night and Fog in class, and afterwards I had like a really big guttural feeling to it. And it mostly felt guttural because of the fact that the images were very disturbing. And those images really stuck with me through the rest of the day. And I was wondering to myself, why do I feel like this when I watch a documentary, but may not feel the same way when I read a memoir or something like that? I don't have that same reaction to a memoir that I do. So that brings me to my research question, which is whether or not personal testimony is the best way to fully immerse ourselves into the story of the Holocaust. So I argue within my paper and within this presentation that it's not necessarily the best way, because we can't feel the same emotions that people feel when we're listening through personal testimony. So just a disclaimer, I'm not saying that personal testimony is useless. It's not. It's a wonderful thing. And in order to get the full picture, we need that personal testimony. But I'm just saying in terms of feeling emotions, that documentaries and pictures of where the event happened put the viewer in the shoes of a survivor, which makes them feel similar emotions and feelings to what a survivor would feel. So again, personal testimonies are important. So one of the things that I wanted to look at when I was researching this was the failures of language when it comes to talking about this topic. So I'll challenge you for a few seconds of awkward silence here. How would you describe the Holocaust in one sentence? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that here. So I assume that some of the words that you came up with probably included depressing, dark, and horrible, which it was. Those are very accurate descriptions of the Holocaust, but that doesn't really encapsulate what the Holocaust felt like. So over here I've got a quote from Primo Levi, and it says, "We say hunger, we say tiredness, fear, pain, we say winter, and they are different things. They are free words created by men who lived in comfort and suffering in their homes." So what Levi is trying to say here is basically that the word for hunger has a different meaning for him than it does for us. So when he says hunger, he means maybe he hasn't eaten in 3 days. When we say hunger, maybe we just skipped a meal or two. So they have very different different connotations. So when he goes on to say that if there was a language created in the lager or the camps, that it would be a very different and vulgar language, that only people who have gone through that similar shared experience will have that understanding of what the language meant. So that's exactly what I argue, which is we don't have a shared experience with Holocaust survivors, therefore we cannot truly understand what they feel and how they feel it. So, of course, when I was looking at this, I wanted to look at Hank Greenspan's The Unsaid, The Incommunicable, The Unbearable, and The Irretrievable. It's a long name. So, over in this article, he says that when giving testimonies, survivors tend to choose what they say and choose what not to say based on the reactions of their interviewer. So let's say, for an example, they say something horrific and the interviewer doesn't have a reaction. Then that survivor knows that that interviewer doesn't have the relation to what they just said, therefore they might leave things out in the future when they're talking about it. And he goes on with the quote that they can't understand. This is from a Holocaust survivor. They can't relate to the terror, the smell, the chaos, the dead bodies all around. How can they relate to that? So if we can't relate to it, we won't be able to understand it. And then also he says and argues that people tend to leave things out when talking about the Holocaust because it goes against the narrative of what the Holocaust normally is. So it goes against the dark and depressing words that you thought when I asked you for the sentence. And that pretty much gets rid of all of the heroic stories that we can hear within the Holocaust, which means we don't get the full story. And then he goes on more to say that survivors couldn't even grasp what was going on. So how can we grasp what's going on? And I've got a quote here that says, "How could I make you understand that something my own mind couldn't understand at the time?" So that is the big language barrier between survivors and people who are trying to learn about the Holocaust. So I'm going to go on to explain some of the sources I used for saying that documentaries and images are very important in Holocaust studies. So this is Organized for Genocide, Student Reactions and Learnings from Use of Emotive Documentaries on the Holocaust. So this was a professional study that was done where students were asked to do a reflection, and that reflection included either like a drawing or a written response to what they were watching. And it was observed with some wonder that students seemed to actually experience the death camps in a way that led to reality-based learning. Now, when he says experience, they mean that they felt the imagination of what could happen based on looking at those images. So, of course, like, they were not in that time, so they do not know what it was like, but they get a picture from images, and they can feel a similar feeling to what it was like. So, again, this idea of imagination is what makes Holocaust documentaries and images so powerful. So, he goes on to say the effective response of students to the use of documentaries appeared to increase their engagement with tasks even when that emotion was considered to be socially negative. So the shock and horror aspect, it still improved their ideas of what the Holocaust was. And this big idea of people engaged through emotion. So it's a very big thing with emotion, because when we're talking about emotion, I like to separate it into two categories: sympathy and empathy. So with sympathy, we can feel concern for people and we can feel pity for people, but we do not know what they went through. With empathy, we know what they went through, and that's what empathy is. But we do not have the empathy with these survivors, but these documentaries and these images help us feel that same empathy. All right, so I also looked at photography and memory in Holocaust museums. This was by Rick Crownshaw, and it's about the memorialization in photographs of the time that can be used to pass down the trauma of Holocaust survivors to future generations. So this is a quote that basically says that pictures can help restore the memory that is lost. So oftentimes people forget what's going on, and over time their opinions can change. So that further makes personal testimony a little harder and pictures a little better. So, and then I got another quote here which says, the familiar and familial becomes unfamiliar and defamiliarized. So this is a context of before and after photos. So people look at the family before the Holocaust and they look at them afterwards, and there's a big difference about what's going on. And also, this is one of my holes in my research project, that pictures are biased. There are motivations behind taking pictures, but they are still a moment captured in time, which means that they are fact. No matter what the biases are, it's happened. And then I also read a I read a resource that is Sources for Studying the Holocaust, and it's a guide. I know Dr. Simon has a chapter in it. But our memories are subject to change over time. This is what I was saying, when people forget sometimes what the Holocaust was. And that change over time makes personal testimony, honestly, maybe not the best way or reliable way of getting information about the Holocaust. And then he also goes on to say, or talk about the representations of the Holocaust through photography. So he says that photographs are tasked to assist in transmitting the scope and scale of these atrocities. So it's, again, a moment captured in time that we can see for ourselves through the lens of a camera. And then he talks about the representation of the Holocaust through movies. Now, movies aren't the most reliable source, but there are definitely artistic representations within those movies that make us understand a little bit more about what the Holocaust is saying. So over here I say that certainly they evoke images and emotions that have an immediacy rarely found in all but the most outstanding written forms. So it's that idea of we can show rather than tell. And then I've also got the engage them emotionally as well as intellectually, that process of engaging emotionally. So that moves on to my unreliable source, which is The Son of Saul. So this movie is a portrayal of what it's like to be a Jewish Sonderkommando. And of course, it's not the most reliable source, like I keep saying, but it is supposed to be artistic. And the way that the director makes it artistic, there was one important thing that I thought was really, really, really good, which is the use of a blurred background anytime Saul is doing anything related to his job. So this blurred background is mostly mostly a call to disassociation, like what that feeling of being able to separate yourself from your work because of the fact that it is so horrible that you have to separate yourself in order to do it. So my main question for this was, why did the directors decide to do this? And I really think it was a big thing about talking about what it was like to be in those shoes. Other than that, I think I'm good. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, and I will happily answer.
Thank you so much, Erin. And just so you all know, not to embarrass you, Erin is a first-year student, and we are very excited for the years ahead. Like, just an amazing job. So, thank you. Questions?
So what is a Sunder Commando?
So when you're talking about Sonderkommando, these are the people who are in Auschwitz that did the dirty jobs of dragging the bodies out of the gas chambers, like basically rooting through the clothes, that kind of stuff. So they did a lot with the burning of the bodies and all that. So bad stuff. Anyone else?
Maybe say a word
Oh.
about how they were chosen to do that.
Oh, yeah. So they were chosen pretty much at random. I mean, a lot of the times new transports would come in, and the Nazis would just take a portion of them and bring them over there. A lot of the times it was circled through, like the unit was circled through quite a bit. So when a new transport came, a lot of them were killed, and then the new people replaced the old people.
Alex and then Matt.
First of all, great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess secondly, regarding movies, like representations of the Holocaust in movies. So you mentioned how like Son of Saul is like not a very good representation beyond that like one point you really enjoyed. But I guess just overall, even if the movie is like not the best representation, do you think that it's important to like have that either way because it opens up like a larger audience to like many things that happened in the Holocaust? Because I'm assuming many people would not know what a Sonder Commando is going into Son of Saul. Do you think it's still important to like have those representations even if sometimes it could be flawed?
Yes, absolutely. I really think that movies are a really good source of information, even though it might not be the most credible. It opens up it to, like you said, audiences that might not normally learn about the Holocaust in the normal sense of, you know, diaries and written works. So yes, I do believe that it is one of the best ways to do that.
And I think you're also referring in your presentation in your paper to the way that the artistic choices themselves, like the blurring, can bring an extra kind of element of emotional understanding. So they even have a separate value, obviously a written document, which is my bread and butter, but a written document doesn't have as much leeway to use, you know, visual as well as verbal and, you know, auditory, I guess, with music, right? There are so many different elements that film can bring, and so the artistry itself can enhance emotional understanding even if it's not factually correct. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I want to ask you about the first point you made about words and images, about the fact that testimonies and descriptions somehow don't convey the full understanding of what the Holocaust was, and we need to see images to awaken emotions and empathy. And my question thinking about that is, are emotions really, and images and emotions, do those really give us a better understanding? And what I had in mind is that I feel strong emotions when I see images of a wide range of things. When I see images of sort of suffering near the border in Texas, or when I see images of poverty in rural Appalachia, or when I see images from Gaza right now, those all arouse they arouse shock, they arouse empathy. But doesn't something get lost if I only see images and I don't understand what's unique about each case and what are the causes and the problems and the ways to address it? So I guess I would push back a little bit on your thought that images are the way to teach this, and I wonder what you think about that.
So absolutely, Dr. Simon and I did discuss this a little bit when we were talking about my paper, and there comes a point where you look at the images and it's sometimes just too much and it overloads your emotional response to it, and you just kind of shut down when you look at the images sometimes. So sometimes images cannot be the best way, but if you can emotionally connect with the images and have like that emotional learning, you have a similar feeling to what they might have felt when they were going through the process. And through that, we learn a little bit more about who these survivors are and what they've gone through. Does that sort of answer your question, or?
Yes, sort of.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation very much, and amazed at your age and interest. For us older folks, it's really reassuring. My question is twofold. One is, with the number of living Holocaust survivors declining significantly, and within a few years there will be none, and the Holocaust denier growing, so to speak, I wonder how you can relate to that or comment on it. I know it's not directly related to your topic, but I'm sure that you don't mind the question. With help from the teacher.
Yes, happy to chime in.
So you're more referring to, as people start to die off, like that.
Well, I personally believe that if you talk to a survivor who's willing to talk, which is another problem in itself, you gain a lot. That type of person is now diminishing because they're not many alive.
Yeah.
Okay, and then juxtaposed with, there's a lot of Holocaust deniers out there, and that seems to be a topic that will become more visible in the future when the Holocaust is further behind us. So I know that's not really a question, but it's a topic.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're studying your.
Yeah. So. As we see with a lot of the foundations and stuff, they do a lot of personal testimony through video. So they'll take a video of an interview with a survivor, and that video is always going to be here. So it will always be, in some aspects, here, if that sort of answers your question.
It's available to see and will be used as a teaching tool.
Yes, I hope so, at least.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's a great answer in that that's why organizations like the Shoah Foundation, and that's only the biggest, but so many other local organizations, including the Farmington Hills Museum, the Holocaust Museum in DC, have taken all of these oral testimonies. And I think amongst Holocaust researchers, this is a huge question that every conference I go to, there are panels and panels about how will we continue to teach the Holocaust effectively after survivors have passed away. There have been recent studies that have shown that the kind of the single most important way that students engage with the Holocaust and then take away some kind of element of empathy and bring that to their lives outside of just learning about the Holocaust is through interacting with a Holocaust survivor, but followed closely by experiencing Holocaust survivor testimonies, interviews, and being able to make that personal connection. Even though you're not speaking with them in person, they're when you watch a 2.5 hour video of somebody telling their whole life story, you do become personally engaged. And I think, as Aaron so clearly stated at the start, he's not saying don't look at that, but also that there are all these other ways to also reach. I think part of what is behind your question is also like younger audiences with different, right? Maybe they're not going to sit and watch a 2.5 hour testimony outside of a classroom, but these films can kind of get at some of those stories and truths behind the stories in ways that reach broader audiences. And so it's about all of it, right? All of these methods of remembering together. And I think that's the only way is, right, reaching people where they're at. And this is something else that we talked about. I'm a very, as an academic, I'm a very verbal person. So when I read a diary or a testimony, I mean, I'm impacted, as much or more than when I watch, documentary necessarily. But a lot of other people are more visual learners, or, right, we all have different ways that we kind of interact with the world. So that's another aspect of it, that this is your perspective backed up by, research that has proven the usefulness of images in documentary. But, we all have our own ways of learning too. Questions? I already asked Aaron all the questions. he presented earlier in class this week, so I don't necessarily have more except for to continue looking at the emotions question. My book is on emotions in Holocaust diaries, which is different, but also gets at like what do emotions do, and so just continuing that research. He has another couple weeks before the paper's due, so to tweak, yeah, to tweak the arguments and pull everything together. So thank you so much.
for all the presentations. So for the second panel, I just want to introduce Dr. Laura Yaris. She's a core faculty member in the Religious Studies Department and teaches classes on Judaism and Jewish identity, among other classes, has a wealth of experience and a new book out as well, and a very, very dedicated and excellent teacher. So I'll hand it over to you to introduce.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yael. I don't think anyone said something that nice about me for a long time. So delighted that we have two presentations today on my favorite topic, which is religion, one of those topics you're told never to discuss at dinner parties, but which I always discuss at dinner parties. So first, I'd like to invite up Maya Weisberger, who is going to talk about spiritual style across Israel. Maya, take it away. It's to you. Here we go.
Cool. Hi, I'm Maya Weisberger, and I'll be presenting on spiritual style across Israel. So, this past summer, I spent a month studying abroad at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I spent that time studying spiritual style and the different effects that come from wearing religious apparel. So before going into this, I knew that people wore different clothing to express themselves and their identity, that different religions have different customs and requirements for clothing, and depending on the level of religion, people decide to follow or ignore the different rules. So someone who, like a nun, is going to wear a full attire for their religion all the time, but another person may not. So the questions and topics that will be discussed. How do different people express their spirituality and religion through what they wear? How do family and ethnic backgrounds influence people's clothing and how they form their own style? And how do individuals view modesty norms in their own community? Do they see them as oppressive or enlightening? So I began my research by interviewing people that I found around in different cities in Israel and having their opinions on their style and how it affects them in their daily lives. So first, in Jerusalem, I interviewed a Russian woman. She had recently immigrated to Israel, and she considers herself Jewish. Russia is known for not being the most friendly to Jews, so she explained that she left for religious freedom, so that she would be able to safely practice her religion. She does not wear any religiously specific items, and that is due to growing up in a society that is not accepting of Jews. She has yet to decide if Israel is going to help her on her path towards religious freedom, but she is optimistic. Next, also in Jerusalem, I interviewed an Australian woman. She describes herself as modern Orthodox, and she was originally born in South Africa, moved to Australia at a young age, and recently, within 2 months of the conversation we had, immigrated to Israel. All she wears is a Star of David necklace, and the necklace has a bunch of other charms on it. So it is not just the star that is being presented. It shows that her personality is more than just Judaism. She has more going on. At the time that we talked, she was wearing very modest clothing, a skirt down to the ground, covered her shoulders, and stuff like that. But she explained she does not wear that for her own personal preference. She wore that because we are in a religious area. She wants to respect the people that are around her and make them feel more comfortable in their own community. Next, I traveled down to southern areas, such as Rahat, and talked to an Afro-Bedouin woman. The Bedouin people are a nomad people that live in the Negev area of Israel, which is the desert portion. Of them is a minority of Afro-Bedouins, and they are seen as second-class citizens to the other Bedouins. And as a part of Bedouin culture, women are also seen as second-class citizens. So this woman is at the peak of oppression for her own people. She, as you can see in the photo, this is the woman I spoke to. She dresses very modestly every single day, and she associates that with her religion. She is a Muslim, and she goes to mosque. She practices, so she gives off that image in her daily life. She explains that even in her own community, she gets discriminated against because people will look at her, see she looks different, even though she is still a Bedouin, and make her feel like less. Even when she leaves her area, people can see how she dresses and how she looks, and immediately categorize her as an Afro-Bedouin and make her feel not like an equal. She explained the only place she truly felt like everyone else was at university, where it's more diverse in a smaller, concentrated area. Next, I traveled to Tel Aviv and talked to a Tel Avivian man. He explained that he grew up in Tel Aviv. He is a secular Jew, which is a non-practicing, non-religious Jew. And his close family bond is what influenced his style. His family was very accepting and close, so they allowed him to grow up in an atmosphere that let him express himself through what he wore and not make him feel oppressed in any way for wanting to dress differently or express himself. He says that by dressing how he wants, he feels most connected to his true self. He doesn't wear anything specifically religious or spiritual, and that is a norm in Tel Aviv. The majority of people are secular Jews, and they do not wear religiously specific attire. So he feels like he's just like everyone else while in Tel Aviv. But when he leaves Tel Aviv, he explained that in Jerusalem or other very religious areas, he does feel oppressed. Other Jews will look at him like he's not a real Jew because he's not Orthodox or of that standard of religion. Next, instead of just interviewing people, I sat and I observed the different atmospheres in the different cities that I visited. First, Jerusalem. I noticed that in Jerusalem, it was mainly modest attire. It was a very calm atmosphere, and it very much felt like you were living the past. Every building is made of the same stone. Everyone is very modest dressing. Little kids running around also wearing religious attire. It was also very diverse. So I would see a nun going in one direction and then a rabbi walking in the opposite direction, which is not necessarily something you'll see anywhere else. Everyone seemed very friendly. I saw a mom go and talk to a friend that she ran into on the street and let the kids run off and play around on rocks or whatever they could find that little kids want to play around on. And it was very specific religious attire everywhere. Next, I observed Tel Aviv. Here, it was much more diverse and different levels of modesty. A lot less modest in general because this is not necessarily the most religious area of Israel. So there was people wearing all different things. There could be someone wearing a bikini walking around or someone in a sundress down to the ground with their arms fully covered. Next, I visited an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. The ultra-Orthodox people keep themselves in secluded areas in different parts of Israel. So here, as you can see, all the men dress almost the exact same. The women dress in very similar attire too, extremely modest. The only thing that differs for the women is the patterns and colors that they wear. Even the children are in full religious attire all the time. It is a very unfriendly feeling when you walk into this area for outsiders. They can look at you and tell that you do not fit in and you are not one of them, and they will make you feel like you do not fit in. They are very stubborn on their beliefs, and they do not accept people in their community that do not believe the exact same thing that they do. And in their area, because of their beliefs, there's a lack of modern technology. There are no smartphones to be seen there. They do not believe that that is a part that is going to help their life benefit in any way. And they do discriminate against people who look different. They will take pictures of you if you don't look the same because it's a spectacle. And when they leave their community, people can tell that they are a part of the ultra-Orthodox community just by how they look. Next, I visited a few religious sites. They're all going to be grouped here. They're very similar. The main sites I visited were the Kotel, which is the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and an Afro-Bedouin mosque in Rahat. The Kotel and the church were both in Jerusalem. At all three of these sites, we were asked to dress modestly, different levels of modesty based on the different areas. Each religious site expected different things. So at the mosque, women had to wear head wraps to cover our hairs. And at the Kotel, we were required to wear skirts past our knees and cover our shoulders. It was very apparent that women were more targeted for these modest attires than men. It was at the Kotel. There is a group of women who, if they see someone not wearing a skirt, they will find you with a scarf and cover you up because it is not modest enough and not respectful enough for them. But on the men's side, you're not going to see this. It was very strict everywhere you went, and if you did not fit in, you felt like you didn't fit in. It felt the conformity everywhere, so everyone had to look the same, to feel the same, and give the similar spiritual appearance to make everyone feel included. And in spaces like this, it can be enlightening to all look the same, to all have the same beliefs, and to be in a holy area where your spirituality can be at its peak. My personal experience. So before October 7th, I wore a Jewish star every day. I wore Hebrew writing on my clothing. I have Jewish stickers on my computers. I have a mezuzah on my dorm door. But after October 7th, my feelings towards all of that changed. I was scared to walk around wearing a star or wearing Hebrew for the fear of being discriminated against in my own community here at Michigan State. I was scared that if someone saw me with a star, they would make hateful comments or even worse, hateful actions. I had conversations with my roommate about maybe taking the mezuzah down so that we wouldn't be a target for attacks. And that's not something that someone should have to discuss in their home, in their community that they once felt safe. Other than the bad stuff, there was good that came out of it. The Jewish community here came together and was stronger than ever. There were more events and you felt stronger when you were in a group, even though it was less safe, because a group of Jews in an area can be a target. But even though it was a target, we still felt safe because we were together. Over time, the fear for all of this has diminished. It is a little bit better now, still not to where it was before the attack, but slowly it is going back to how it was before. But this attack has brought light to the intensity of anti-Semitism and hate in areas like college campuses. people see it as not necessarily a religious area, but if you express yourself, you can get hated for it and feel discriminated against and oppressed in your own home. In summary, in Israel, clothing and levels of modesty are used as ways for people to express themselves and for many people to express their religious beliefs. Most people dress based on their communal identity, but do not feel oppressed by this decision, although this is not consistent everywhere you go. Tragic events can increase minority discrimination and hate, but also bring communities closer together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. And next we have Joe Norden, who's going to talk to us about secularization and tradition. Whoops. Understanding religious beliefs when secular practices disappoint. Here you go, Joe.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Norden, and not this semester, but last semester, I had the pleasure of doing an independent study with Professor Lorch on Jewish philosophy, intended to start out to really understand the significance of our most important Jewish thinkers, authors like the Rambam. But after October 7th, we moved in a more different direction, trying to help my personal understanding of Judaism, what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. And so this is kind of my response, my response to the research that I've done. So in reading the works of Leo Strauss, I grew fascinated by the tension between the modern Jewry and political liberalism. We take pride in our Judaism. We express that pride in distinctly non-Jewish ways. The most prominent of these ways, assimilation and political Zionism, they take over Judaism as the expression of one's Jewish identity, as Jews desired the promise of acceptance that liberalism offered but failed to deliver. Strauss, seeing no way out of this issue in his work titled Why We Remain Jews, called for a return to our tradition, to understand the Jewish people as they should be understood, as a religious people. I analyzed the two popular responses of Jews toward the animosity they face under liberalism. As Jews gravitated towards these ideologies, they supplanted the traditional expressions of Judaism, and they received disappointing results. Given the weakness of these strategies, I turned to a deeper understanding of our important beliefs as articulated by the Rambam. Because returning to the faith of our ancestors can guide the Jewish people towards greater resilience than abandoning Judaism or Zionist liberation ideology. So let me first start with assimilation. What I mean by assimilation is not a change or adaptation of practice. Jews have shifted their lives and cultures greatly since living in the diaspora. What I mean by assimilation is this modern approach, the adoption of secular beliefs to conform with liberal society, relinquishing Judaism, relinquishing our religion in part or entirely. But what compels a person to renounce his tradition, to renounce his history? Part of this stems from what Strauss calls the creation of the public-private divide in liberal society, where publicly all are welcome or accepted, and privately one may be excluded for their differing beliefs. This idea of acceptance and ending the discrimination was so powerful for Jews. Strauss states that the obvious solution was to cease recognition as a Jew, so that Jews may be accepted both publicly and privately. Liberalism as a philosophy does not mandate the abandonment of Judaism or any of foundational belief. It merely encourages such through an incentive of public conformity. In his paper titled Jews and Germans, Gershom Scholem works through the relationship between the two groups after German emancipation, demonstrating much about the allure of assimilation as well as its failures. With assimilation came a desire of mass acceptance of Jews by their non-Jewish neighbors. Scholem writes, the unending Jewish demand for a home was soon transformed into an ecstatic illusion of being at home. The religious longing for a homeland and the historical quest for belonging have shaped our tradition significantly. Emancipation and the spread of the Enlightenment values compelled Jews to adopt this philosophy. Jews put an immense effort into join non-Jewish society, and this result is assimilation. Scholem described the consequences of assimilation that still hold true today. He spoke of German Jews attempting to hold on to their Judaism as a heritage, as a creed, as an element unknowable and undefinable, yet present in their consciousness. But this raises the question, if one cannot or will not practice in Judaism, how will they find the strength to take pride in their Jewish identity? Minimal engagement with tradition cannot satisfy the urge to be Jewish, yet this internal dilemma of retaining Judaism while assimilating to secular society remains. The reaction of Gershom Scholem serves us as a warning of today of the consequences of assimilation. He writes that prejudice did not suddenly disappear with emancipation. The most accepting of Germans hoped for full assimilation of their Jewish neighbors, but many saw the immediate fervor of secular German society as more reason to distrust Jews. In their eyes, it reinforced anti-Semitic beliefs, these beliefs that Jews somehow lack a moral character. Despite the goal of acceptance, the animosity was simply redirected. More than that, Scholem suggests assimilation deepened the exclusionary hate that Jews experienced. Jews did enter and participate in German society at a spectacular rate, and the adoption of more liberal German values did lead to relationships that did not exist between Jews and Germans. But through his retrospective assessment, Scholem writes of widespread feelings that the emancipation of German Jews heralded the appearance of radical and subversive tendencies. Emancipation and subsequent assimilation did not suddenly end private or even public discrimination. German society buried the discrimination without ever addressing it. If discrimination is made illegal in the public or the private, it is not the hate that will be rejected. It will be the ideas of liberalism with its public-private distinction that will be rejected instead. Because of this, Scholem dispels the notion of National Socialism rising suddenly. We must heed this warning. While we may think that hate has been dispelled, if given the opportunity, it will rear its ugly head. Scholem lays out the reaction of Germans to assimilation, but what of the effect of Jews? Our tradition provides many examples of Jewish suffering, but it also shows us a way through that suffering. When we dilute our Judaism to an idea, we lose touch with the resilience that guided us through centuries of pain and exile. We lose touch with our past and our most crucial source of perseverance, our faith. Strauss goes so far to say that assimilation required inner enslavement for the price of our external freedom. For a people with a storied history and code devoted to faith and righteous living, assimilation did not hold the key to escaping hate. Our dilemma continues today. Strauss summarizes Judaism as a concern with return, not with progress. The values of our tradition are fundamentally at odds with those of liberalism. Judaism invokes the past, our reliance on Torah as a guide to living well, and our belief that redemption involves a return to a previous state with the coming of the Messiah. Progress is the ideal of liberalism. It supposes something which is simply good or the end as the goal of progress. Quoting Strauss, "The concern with the past is only to teach us to improve for the future. The past is incomplete. It needs correction. Ultimately, the reverence of the past does not fit into this framework of liberalism. If one believes he can take part in the progressive idea, he must renounce part of his faith. Assimilation attempts to take the values of liberalism and pass them off as Jewish values, but this is not the case. Even if this leads to the denouncement of Jews, it is nobler and better to retain one's faith than to profit from progress and face this internal tension." This is what Strauss argues. Having shown assimilation as a lacking solution to our crisis of modern Judaism, I turn to the other modern development of non-religious Jewish expression, political Zionism. I say political Zionism because although our tradition teaches us about a return to Zion, political Zionism is an expression of the purely human will to create a Jewish state. This ideology arose as a competing claim for the future of Jews under liberalism, achieving legitimacy as assimilation disappointed. In his pamphlet titled Auto-Emancipation, Leo Pinsker argued that the only path to redemption was a Jewish drive to form a nation, and admission into the ranks of other nations seemed illusory. He believed Jews had lived separately for too long to be accepted, and thus should find a way to live as a separate nation. The benefit of this approach, the political Zionists claimed, would be the quelling of hatred from non-Jews. He imagined a formation of a Jewish nation would generate the respect and acceptance that the Jews required, unconvinced that what he viewed as the Jewish question would disappear through assimilation in Europe. The idea was so permeating for Pinsker that he declared it is our bounden duty to devote all of our remaining moral force to reestablishing ourselves as a living nation, so that we may finally assume a more fitting and dignified role. Although repudiating assimilation, political Zionists lean towards the virtues of liberal ideology, shifting faith from divine redemption to prioritization of human agency over religious sentiments. Political Zionism, however, poses two issues. Salvation without faith is impossible. Zionism cannot form without inspiration and the application of religious belief. And two, political Zionism, as explicated by Pinsker, is tantamount to assimilation. I will read a quote from Strauss that summarizes the first point. Zionism was strictly limited to political action. The mind was in no way employed, or even the heart was in no way employed in matters Jewish. Now, this led very early to the reaction in opposition to political Zionism by cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism means that it's simply not enough to have a Jewish state. The state must also have a Jewish culture. In other words, Jewish culture means the product of a Jewish mind in contradistinction to other national minds. If we look, however, at what this means in specific terms, we see that the rock bottom of any Jewish culture is the Bible, the Talmud, and the Midrash. And if you take these things with the minimum respect of seriousness, you must say that they were not meant to be products of the Jewish mind. They were meant to be ultimately from heaven. And this is the crux of the matter. Judaism cannot be understood as a culture. The substance is not culture, but divine revelation. Therefore, the only consistent solution is that which abandons or which goes beyond cultural Zionism and clearly becomes religious Zionism. And this means return to Jewish faith, return to the faith of our ancestors. Now, if one starts with a desire for a Jewish state centered on the historical homeland, then intentionally or not, forces within ourselves will start demanding Jewish control over an entire historical area. Political Zionism cannot fulfill within Jews the place of religion in creating a separate Jewish state. Solidarity movements echo qualities from the Jewish tradition, but they hinder purely political solutions. Pinsker himself even warned against reestablishing Zion in auto-emancipation. His appeal of human will, self-determination, and nationalism stemmed from Enlightenment values, not religion. His vision expressed itself as a different form of assimilation, hoping Jewish participation in the ideals of liberalism would work where he believed faith had failed. But committing oneself to a supposed Jewish ideology without substantive engagement with tradition sows the internal tension we witness playing out in Israel and the diaspora today. Invoking Zionism invokes Judaism. And if one cannot bring themselves to believe the tradition, then why would they bring themselves to believe in Zionism? In these political and social upheavals, I mentioned the importance of the Jewish tradition in guiding our people and the shortcomings of abandoning our religious beliefs. Studying the Rambam illuminates the truth of our beliefs and underscores Judaism's profound impact on our lives, surpassing transient political solutions. The guide of the perplexed begins with the true depiction of God, which man is said to be made in his image. The Rambam links human intellect to God's abstract intellect, emphasizing the incomprehensibility of God's essence, inspiring awe and reverence. Jews see themselves as chosen due to their intellectual likeness to God and their role as custodians of divine revelation, distinguishing their unique status among the peoples. Furthermore, Rambam illuminates that Judaism rests in the faith in the creation of the world. Maimonides says in the guide, "Know that with a belief in the creation of the world and time, all the miracles become possible and the law becomes possible, and all questions that may be asked on the subject vanish." If we put our faith in this truth, then our guiding principles and laws will remain true as well. And most importantly for our tradition, the Rambam affirms the divinity and the purpose of Torah in our lives. As God is perfect and his creation is perfect, our law is perfect as well. Those who deem its burdens are difficult to bear, this is due to an error in considering them, he states. The Jews who reject Torah, he believes, have merely misunderstood its meaning and its role in shaping our lives. The law of Moses, our master, and I quote, has come to bring us both perfections, the well-being of the states of people in their relations with one another through the abolition of reciprocal wrongdoing and through the acquisition of a noble and excellent character. With faith in God, his wisdom, and his creation, then faith in the purpose of the Torah follows. This purpose is to better us, to make us close to his image of perfection. If we abandon the Torah due to perceived pain, it will not bring us the reprieve needed. The wisdom of the Rambam leads us to the realization that more faith, not less, is required. Human action alone cannot redeem the Jewish people, for the idea of Jews as a people was not created through our hands alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really thought-provoking and interesting presentations. I just based on what I heard today and based on the brief reading I was able to give of your papers yesterday, I'm going to offer just a few reflections on what I hear when I listen to your work as a scholar of religion, right, as a religious studies scholar. So what I hear you both saying, right, and really illuminating and texturing for us is the fact that when we think about religious traditions and religious cultures, right, we're looking at really multivalent expressions of human identity. We are looking across political philosophy. We're looking across ethical traditions. We're looking at body law and what people wear. We're looking at how people conceive themselves to be a human being in relation to their immediate communities, their more proximate communities, and also their more distant communities, right? And all of these things are what creates religious expression, self-conceptualizations, and identity as both perceived by the insiders of those groups and also by the outsiders of those groups, right? And so I see you really both bringing to light just how dynamic and multivalent the study of religion is, and that's certainly something that religious studies scholars very much affirm. So in terms of just a few comments on both of your individual presentations, Joe, you really took us on a tour de force, right, of the Rambam through Pinsker and Scholem and Leo Strauss and so many important thinkers. And what was really interesting to me is that you present the philosophers, right, that you've engaged with as in some ways doing something quite different to the Rambam, right? That I heard you express in some ways as an act of capitulation, right? Of imagining Judaism in terms of the philosophies of the day, right? Whether in the concept of contemporary ethno-nationalism or in the context of emancipation. And in contrast, you present the Rambam, right, as offering something that I hear you describing as more essential, right, a sort of truer form of Jewishness anchored in the Torah. And I find that so fascinating because when I teach the Rambam, what I typically emphasize is that the Rambam himself is doing something quite new. And what he was doing was so controversial that within a few years of his death, the Guide to the Perplexed was being burned in Europe because he was considered so radical, right? And what he was trying to do was he was trying to present Judaism so that it would be comprehensible and understandable and indeed appealing to intellectuals within his community who were very well versed in Aristotelian philosophy, which was very much the kind of intellectual current of its day, and who, based on this knowledge, looked at some of the claims made in the Torah and said, well, this is ridiculous, right? How can we sign ourselves up to this, right? Because if Aristotelian philosophy talks about God as non-corporeal, well, you read the first verses of the Torah, and God is clearly walking through the Garden of Eden and smelling scents and having conversations. And how can these things be reconciled? So his project, right, in the Guide to Perplexed is to reconcile those things and to say how the Torah can be read as a work of Aristotelian philosophy, right? How Aristotelian philosophy is compatible with all of the things said in the Torah. So in this too, the Rambam is trying to synthesize and harmonize what he understands about Judaism with the contemporary intellectual currents of his age to make Judaism make sense, right, in the language that his interlocutors knew most intimately, right, which was the language of philosophy. And he's talking primarily to folks who were who had the experience of being crypto-Jews, who had sort of lived outwardly as members of other faith communities, right, and who were beginning to kind of re-engage with a sense of their own Jewishness. It's only with the passage of time, right, that the Rambam has come to be seen as small o orthodox or canonical, right? But in his time, he was a revolutionary to the extent that in Ashkenaz, he was considered so dangerous that his books were burnt. So I sort of offer that as a way of reminding ourselves that 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 what today we consider sort of traditional at some point, right, was revolutionary. And what it reminds us is that Judaism is quite unlikely to be accurately described as an essence that can be returned to or reconceptualized, but rather is something that is created and recreated anew with each new generation as they live out, right, what Jewishness means in the context of their day and age. So turning now to Maya. Where's Maya? There you are. Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. Some of my work is also in ethnography, so I also spend time doing the kinds of things that you do, right? Which is going out, observing people, and interviewing people and talking to them and trying to understand a little bit more about their lives, to understand how they make choices, right? About how they express themselves religiously. And what I really appreciated about your project was the way that you did this across communities, and you used multiple methods, right, of both observation and also interviewing. Again, in terms of methodology, what I think a lot of social scientists would, the terms that they would use to describe the method that you employ here is something called random sampling, right? You kind of met people, and based on that, what they were wearing on that particular day, you painted a picture for us of who they are. And I wonder, right, if we had met different kinds of representatives of those communities, or if you had interviewed the same people on a different day of the year, would their self-presentation have looked different? Would it have looked different, for example, if you interviewed this breadth of people on, say, Yom Kippur? Would their dress be less similar? More similar? How about another time of the year? How about when they were meeting with their families, right? And so these are always the sort of questions that we can ask, right? When we think about random sampling as a methodology. I think one of the things that you also really kind of highlight in the presentation is that even within specific identity groups, there is room for flexibility. And this is where I might push you to be sort of really careful with some of the language that you used. Because I was struck by the fact that I think your second interviewee, you described as a modern Orthodox woman, right, who does not typically wear modest attire. She was rather wearing it in accordance with the area of town that she was going into. Now, typically, right, we might expect somebody who self-identifies as modern Orthodox, right, as Orthodox, to have tzinut, modesty, right, as an ethical value. But what you told us is that this woman, right, has a more flexible understanding of how her clothing choices relate to her positionality as an Orthodox woman, right? So in some of the ways in which you describe some of these communities, you describe their sort of choices as quite static and as quite fixed, but in others you really show us that there's an enormous amount of flexibility, right, within the choices that they make. And this also, I think, reminds us that our positionality as outsiders is always a little bit limited. Because when we look at how insiders to various communities think about the representative symbolism of clothing choices, right, there are different kind of stakes at issue, right, to when what we can get from a sort of outsider gaze. So, for example, I'm minded of the fact that in many ultra-Orthodox communities, right, it really matters whether you wear, for example, a sheitel, a wig, on its own, or a sheitel and a hat on top of it. Right? Both of those, from an outside perspective, are indicators of a commitment to modesty, right? But within the community, right, your choice to wear not one but two head coverings has a lot to say about where you situate yourself on what observable modesty looks like. Right? I'm also thinking, and this is a really, really great thing to notice, particularly in Israel, of the symbolisms attached to the material that a kippah is made out of, right? So on the face of it, if you look at 10 people who are all wearing a kippah, you might be tempted to say, well, these are all religiously observant Jews. But whether they are wearing a black velvet kippah, right, versus a kippah sruga, a woven, right, kippah, tells us a lot about where they situate themselves on the ideological spectrum of religious Jewishness and political Zionism as well. The last thing that I want to say is that one of the things that really jumped out at me from your presentation was what it felt to you to feel like a spectacle when visiting the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood that you spoke about. Because this is an idea that ethnographers, I think, wrestle with quite a bit, right? Is this question of when we are doing this kinds of work, when we are photographing people, for example, and interviewing them, just as you yourself were photographed and felt like a spectacle, what are we doing that might make our interlocutors also feel like spectacles, right, as things to be gazed at and wondered at and exoticized. And I think ultimately the only way to really kind of mitigate that very real danger, right, of making our subjects into spectacles is by telling their life stories and telling their life stories in terms that they use themselves, which I think you gave us a really nice glimpse into with some of the stories that you shared today. So thank you all very much, and I think we can open it up for questions for Joe and Maya. We have, how long, Yael, for questions? Yeah, come. Okay, don't be shy, audience. What we got? You're a...
Thank you guys for two very compelling presentations. I'd like to kind of ask the two of you the same question, but I'd like to get the two different perspectives. I think both of you talk about experiences that were meaningful to you and that made you think about things in a different way. A philosopher that I like a lot, Hans-Georg Gadamer, says that we have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable to our experience, which means that we allow the experience to change us in one way or another. So I would like to hear from you guys how your experiences changed you and changed how you understand your identity and what it means to be you in this world.
So for me personally, after that experience, especially with the personal statement that I gave, I was able to look at that in a more analytical way and see the effects and what caused those outcomes. What made me feel that way? What outside effects did I feel like safe or unsafe? And being able to see other cultures and other peoples in those different atmospheres made me more aware of the shift in the atmosphere that I was currently living in. And be able to talk about it and analyze it instead of just having an emotional response to it.
I think for me, my moment of like personal experience, vulnerability. I think it was probably reading Nietzsche actually in 371 when we read Beyond Good and Evil. There was something compelling about his idea of what it meant to exercise one's will to power. That when we read Strauss for my independent study, like Strauss is very clearly inspired, or at least recognizes the importance of Nietzsche as a philosopher. And what does it mean to be Jewish, to have foundational beliefs in a postmodernist society? And either you renounce it entirely and you give in to the herd morality, or you do what Jews have done, as Nietzsche points out, for centuries, which is use the Torah, use their traditions to exercise their will to power and to overcome. So that was actually what inspired me the most.
Thank you. My question is for Joe. I guess, first of all, congratulations on finishing the paper from your independent study, and I look forward to reading it. But I guess I have two quick comments and then one question. So about each of your three parts. Your point about liberalism, I would just point out there's probably a huge difference between the German liberalism or the experience of Jews in Germany in the 19th century that Sholem is describing, that very harsh life, and the experience of Jews in the United States, where it is possible to be openly Jewish. We have large communities, and certainly in the public sphere, I think there's a greater commitment to protecting Jews in a liberal society right now in the United States than there ever has been anywhere. And so I wonder if that makes a difference to your analysis. On the subject of Zionism, I think I don't quite follow your critique of political Zionism. My reaction to the last few months would be that there's probably a stronger case to be made that political Zionism as an enterprise may be necessary if Judaism is going to be around in any form. And so I wonder what you'd think about that. But my main reaction listening to your talk was that I'm not sure, I couldn't tell if you really believed what you were saying, which is that here's somebody arguing that liberalism and Zionism are somehow disappointing and we need to return to our traditions. And because I know you, you're not wearing a yarmulke. You are not heading for a yeshiva after you graduate. And in fact, I believe you're going to work in DC, last I heard. And so what does all of this mean to you? I mean, are you convinced by what you're saying? Or are you trying to convince yourself? Or how does this argument fit to you as a person who's clearly not living out your words, I guess is my question.
Yeah, well, sorry. I suppose that I wrote this as kind of a, what's a good analogy? Epistle to Joe is what I'll call it. Because I think that it was kind of a wake-up call for me internally. You know, I struggle. Basically, the tension that I write about is the tension that I feel every single day. How am I, a committed liberal, or committed to the ideals of liberalism, expected to express my Jewish identity when it's clear that there's a difference between how one expresses their tradition and what are the ideas of liberalism. I think to your point about the United States, I thought about this, and I don't know if this interpretation is correct, so I would love to talk about it in office hours, I think in the United States especially, there's been an expansion of the public into the private, and the reason that perhaps Jews are allowed to practice or can practice is because of how much expansion there has been of the public into the private realm. I think about the, when Sholem points out, or when Strauss points out, public and private discrimination. It's like the idea that in public I cannot say I don't want to associate, or I'm not going to allow you into this club because you have a red shirt on. But in private, I would never allow someone who has a red shirt on into my home. And I think in the United States we've tried to expand the public so that you can't even do that in general in the private. I don't know if that's true, and if that's false, then I would love to talk about it. And then so it was just basically me trying to work out how do I find my internal tension of being an assimilated Jew when it is so important that Judaism is not a political enterprise, it's a religious one.
Hi. This question is more directed towards Maya. During your presentation, you did make references to many of the cultures that you looked at and many of the people that you talked to, their religious identities and their religious values focus more heavily on how women were presented in the culture as opposed to men, and that women were expected to be more modest and not so many restrictions on the men. But outside of those communities, when people choose to dress according to their religious beliefs and cultures, do you believe age makes a difference on those choices? And is there a flexibility in people not choosing younger, but then choosing to dress more religious or culturally when they get older?
Yeah, so it's up to the individual. Over time, your religious views can change, and how you want to present yourself can change, especially with age and experience. In the ultra-Orthodox community, for example, like the little girls weren't wearing head coverings or anything like that, but the older women were. So the customs do change for the different communities as you grow, but it is up to the individual to choose if they want to adopt more modesty rules or decrease modesty rules as you get older, as you change.
So if I could just add to that real quick, you know, with head coverings, we wouldn't expect girls, young girls to wear them because it's accustomed to wear them only when one gets married, and one wouldn't assume that little kids were married. But also, it's so interesting to me that you frame this in terms of individual choice, because typically that is not the value that is associated, right, with what we might call maximalist religious communities, and that communal norms are more important as a decision-making factor than, say, individual choice. But I think you're expressing something very, very real, which is that, particularly in the context of modernity, individual choice isn't only a value that, you know, we as non-ultra-Orthodox folks might see as kind of paramount, right, within clothing choices, but that might even be a value that is increasingly becoming part of these communities as well, which are maybe not quite so closed, but in fact porous, right, to ideas from the outside world. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your really interesting and thought-provoking presentations, and for Dr. Yaris for her interesting discussion and the questions. So, yeah, I think it's you both are looking perhaps at the diversity, like you're saying, at different expressions, and I want to also, I guess, push you to what extent, let's say for you, Joe, it seems like you're kind of searching for a truth and like going through logically, and I'm a very logical person as well, like these if and how questions, but it's almost in finding like, oh, one can't, you know, depend on tradition and be progressive in terms of Jewish value, and you're trying to find these contradictions and absolutes. And that can be valid for kind of self-exploration, but I also see this kind of in societies, or even going back to our discussions from last night, as well as people trying to figure out what the way is, right, for Jews. And I guess one thing I put out there is, why not kind of embrace individuals and collectivities choosing to either be political Zionists or not, or going back to tradition in multiple different ways, right, and interpreting Jewish values in multiple different ways, or not, or the extent to which you assimilate. So even, you know, with both of you, and it was very sad to hear how you feel, although I've heard that from other students on campus, and how it kind of makes some maybe want to express something, like maybe your lapel, Joe, on your clothing, and others not, right? So I'm kind of, well, everyone is kind of going through kind of self-exploration. I'm wondering if both of your presentations in some ways can also speak to the diversity, right, of ways within communities in terms of dress at different times, and within Jewish communities in different places, right? That does there have to be one way that everyone should be this and that everyone should be that, and that there's a rather than respecting collectivities and individuals of Jews who find expression in these different ways, either through their clothing or through their ways of ideologies and so forth. So I guess I would put that to you. I don't know.
So I'd say in the different communities, the expectations are different. So some communities, they allow you to express yourself more and be a little more diverse. So in the Michigan State Jewish community, there's people of all different levels of religion, all different levels of expression. And I'd say in the community here, everyone gets to choose how they want to represent themselves and how they want to express their Judaism or religion, and all different religions here. But like in the the ultra-Orthodox community, there's less say in what you get to wear. If you break enough of their modesty rules, you're expelled from their community and no longer allowed. So the different communities have different standards for what is allowed and how much leeway you have with your personal expression.
I'm going to try to give a very Jewish response. So in sitting with one of the individuals who's kind of helped me explore what it means to be a religious Jew, Rabbi Gluck of the Jewish Resource Center, there's this idea that, like, if our Torah of tradition teaches us that this is the path, then there is no other way. It's the Torah. It's divinely inspired. And if you believe that God is a perfect being, then His law is perfect, and this is the way we should act. Now, I'm not wearing a kippah, and last time I checked, I didn't wrap tefillin in a very long time. So I also have this internal struggle as someone who is an adherent of political liberalism, that everybody should be included. And so what is it? Can you be a devout Jew and still include other people? I think so. But I think there's something in us that says that, there's kind of a one way or another. You can either be traditional and accept all Jews with you, but you always work towards helping them understand the practice and the true nature of Torah, or you can adopt liberalism and you can say that I'm willing to include everybody, and I'm working through that right now as I talk. Do I want Jews to be more Jewish? Do I want myself to be more Jewish, or do I want to be as inclusive as possible, because there's not many of us and we need to stand in solidarity with each other as much as possible?
I would just say that there is a middle ground also to be chosen there, which is to say that the Torah actually bears witness to the incredible diversity of Jewish thought and practice, right? That isn't a univocal narrative, but a multiple one that is written over time and across experience, and there is room, right, within the Torah for thinking about Judaism not as a monolithic entity, but rather as a very diverse set of cultural ways, religious ways, ethnic ways, and geographical ways as well. Do we have time for one more question, or? Okay, then please give our presenters a round of applause.
Yeah. Sorry, and then if we have, thank you so much, and then if we have time in the end, we can always kind of have collective questions that may be cross panels in terms of things that we're thinking about. So the third panel will be 3 presentations on Israeli ideologies, literature, and environmental and foreign policy. Do all 3 of you, I don't know if all 3 of you have your presentations already ready, or do you need a couple minutes to? You still, okay, so maybe we'll take a few minute break so that the next presenters, but no more, 5 minutes max, because we're running kind of behind in our schedule. And we'll just take 5-minute break for people to get a drink, get a restroom, and for the students to put up any presentations that they have. Thanks. End of the semester. So our first presentation is going to be Adam Budiansky. So I was teaching a senior seminar in the fall, this fall, in the dilemmas of asymmetric conflict, where one of the big case studies was past wars between Israel and Hamas, and we were just finishing that, moving on to other areas of the world when October 7th happened. So it was quite a semester, horrible semester, to be discussing these things. But Adam has tried to kind of look at how the current government may have shaped some of the decisions and so forth. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and then we'll hear from others. Yeah. So for
Hi.
about 15 minutes for each one, because I know you have a lot of slides.
Okay, you give me like a 5-minute and like a 1-minute warning. Okay, thank you. Hi, so as Professor Aronoff said, I'm Adam, and I will be discussing the effects of political ideology on asymmetrical warfare. So what asymmetrical, this is just an introduction, we can ignore that. So what asymmetrical warfare is it is when there's a significant difference in power between both sides of a specific conflict. So the conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews is rooted since the start of Jewish migration to mandatory Palestine and leaving the diaspora, and has additional context in thousands of years of history. Since 2006, with Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, wars have been happening between Israel and Hamas, the terrorist organization which was elected to rule Gaza back then. There has not been an election there since. Some countless bouts of violence that have happened other than the wars have been the Second Intifada, the 1929 Hebron massacres, and settler violence. So my thesis is that political ideology has an inherent effect on the observation of international humanitarian law in asymmetrical conflicts. And in terms of this project, I will be focusing again through the lens of international humanitarian law. So the cases that I chose are the current war that is going on in Israel and Gaza, and the second war that I chose is the 2008 war, Operation Cast Lead. And the reason why I chose that particular war is because every other war with Hamas has had Bibi Netanyahu as the prime minister of Israel, whereas in 2008, the prime minister was Ehud Olmert, a left centrist. So I mostly focused on research regarding the deaths in the conflicts, as well as different actions that were taken by either, more specifically Israel, but also Hamas and Fatah, which is the ruling party of the West Bank. And data regarding politics will mostly be taken from the Israeli Policy Forum and the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is based out of Ramallah. I will also be using information and data sources from my own time in Israel, as well as information from professors and research that I have done on my own. And I will be also discussing the judicial upheaval and the levels of dissatisfaction with Bibi and the current government. So what international humanitarian law is it is a set of laws that exist to help protect civilian non-combatants in conflicts, global conflicts. And Israel is a signatory of the Geneva Convention, which it signed in 1951. However, it does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court and holds its own leaders and army accountable in its own courts. Under international humanitarian law, once a school, place of worship, hospital, etc., that is a civilian area, is found to be hosting weapons, combatants, terrorists, etc., it is no longer a valid target. And it also says that governments have to weigh the risk of civilian deaths with the importance of that target, and also take all actions necessary to prevent civilian deaths. So the current war started once on October 7th, when Hamas, a terrorist organization as declared so by the United States government and the European Union, invaded Israel and massacred 1,200 men, women, and children, and kidnapped over 200 people. As a result, Israel is fighting back against Hamas. However, that has seen an astronomical death toll in the 30,000 plus range. I would like to also note that that information does come from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas. Many in Israel have also taken to the streets in protest of Netanyahu's government, and pressure is being put on Netanyahu to stop the deaths from President Biden as well as others. Many Israelis are blaming Bibi for what has been done and his inability to prevent it, and have renewed calls for him to resign. So the war reflects a broader conflict between right and left, in the sense that many on the left side of Israel's government have seen Bibi's actions and the whole of the government's actions as an overreaction. In particular, Israel's counter-reaction to Hamas is an attempt by the government to establish a rally behind the flag effect, as they are currently experiencing a lot of, as I said previously, calls to resign. And as Bibi had said, the only thing that I intend to have resign is Hamas. We're going to resign them to the dustbin of history, he told reporters, and said that's my responsibility. What makes this conflict different from the other wars that have happened previously is that it always starts by Hamas attacking Israel but never invading Israel, like is seen here. Typically, they will just fire rockets into Israel, and then Israel will respond in force as well. So on to my next case. Previous wars between Israel and Hamas have taken place in 2008, 2014, and 2021. In 2008, the war with Hamas was overseen, as I previously mentioned, by Ehud Omer, a left centrist, and he was originally a right-wing, but once he started working with the former Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, he was a chief architect of Sharon's policies in withdrawing from the West Bank, which is something they were overseeing, as well as withdrawing people from the Gaza Strip. However, due to Hamas taking power, this changed the situation, and although he was negotiating a deal with the Palestinian Authority to withdraw from the West Bank and accomplish a two-state solution, that did ultimately fail due to Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority premier, refusing to accept terms that didn't include Jerusalem. In response to rocket fire from Gaza, Ehud Omer announced Operation Cast Lead, which was Israel's ground invasion into Gaza. Prior to the official invasion, Omer warned Hamas that if they stop shooting rockets into Israel, Israel will not fight them, Israel will cease fire on them. And this ultimately happened on January 17th when Omer declared a unilateral ceasefire with Hamas, as he felt that the IDF was able to successfully diminish Hamas's capabilities and their threat to the Israeli people. Operation Cast Lead ultimately resulted in the death toll of 1,387 Palestinians, 773 of them being civilians, and over 5,000 wounded. So as a brief background into what goes on, in Israel and Palestine, there's a major issue and divide between religion, and that causes a lot of hatred for both sides against each other. However, it is important to note that in Israel there is freedom of religion and there are Palestinians in the government. sorry for skipping a few slides. Religion and democracy in Israel do not always go hand in hand. However, just as with many religions, Judaism is equally diverse, with there being multiple different groups, such as the Reform movement, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, Haredi Jews, Orthodox conservatives, and the separation in Judaism really does take form in the Knesset, where there are different parties such as Shas, Yamina, Likud, and Ram, which all have different levels. Okay. Which all have different varying levels of religiosity to them and how strict of an interpretation they have of Judaism. And this can be seen in survey data from the Pew Research Center, where 89% of secular Jews say that democratic principles should take priority over religious law. And that is compared to only 3% of ultra-Orthodox Jews that feel the same way. So the Knesset is elected by party. There's no constituency, which means that there are no connection between the politicians of the Knesset, really, and voters. There's no constituency. An issue with this is that doesn't necessarily reflect the majority of Israeli voters and their opinions in the majority coalition, because it comes down to whoever's able to build the largest coalition of government. And another issue with the existence of this highlights another issue of the existence of ultra-religious parties on both sides, whether that is Jewish or Muslim, because they do not have the same beliefs as Israel's majority secular population. This is just a little bit of the different political parties in Israel. So, and then on to the politics of Gaza and the West Bank. Despite not being a sovereign country, both Gaza and the West Bank have two different ruling governments, Fatah, which rules the West Bank, and Hamas, which rules Gaza. And they've been in power each for many years and have not held elections in a while. So while both are theoretically democratic, the absence of elections alludes to the inadequacy of representation in government, and this can be seen in a July 2023 demonstration in Gaza, which protested the dire living conditions in Gaza, as well as a $15 deduction Hamas takes from the $100 given to the poorest families in Gaza monthly by the Qatari government. In both Gaza and the West Bank, half the population thinks that elections, if they were ever to take place, will neither be free nor fair. A majority does not have faith in the integrity or neutrality of the police forces in both the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It is protecting the election process, and a large majority believes that whoever loses the election will reject the results. A main concern behind this is neither Hamas nor Fatah would be willing to give up power and would actively take actions to prevent the other side from winning an election. The reality is it has been 17 years since an election has taken place there, and there would need to be a complete overhaul of their political system in order to properly allow for free and fair elections. And both Hamas and Fatah use the continued conflict with Israel to push off elections, most notably being the highly anticipated 2015 election, which the Prime Minister of Fatah delayed inevitably. The first notable difference between these two wars is that Omer was willing to avoid war as long as Hamas stopped bombing Israel, and there's a clear difference between, there's no real offer currently from Benjamin Netanyahu to actually end the war, because he's trying to end Hamas completely. While Hamas's infrastructure was crippled in the 2008 war, it was not completely destroyed or even destroyed to the same level, which can be seen so far. And what all this points to is a push, is, as I said, Bibi's push to end Hamas once and for all, rather than allowing them to exist. Yeah. And again, additionally, Hamas has declared that they seek to enact the same events of October 7th again and again until Israel is wiped out. So there's a clear no side is really looking for peace right now. Another main difference is that, as mentioned in Operation Castle, the total death count was 1,387, and the war right now, the death toll is expected to be around 35,000. Additionally, Castle was only 22 days, whereas this current war has been going on for over 6 months now. And while Israel does take actions to prevent the loss of Palestinian lives, it is arguable that the clear difference in how strict international humanitarian law is being observed in the current war does exist when you look at Operation Cast Lead. So while the push for a ceasefire is certainly important, a ceasefire has to be double-sided, and it is important to recognize that on multiple occasions, including October 7th, and more recently with the humanitarian pause that did occur during the war, Hamas has violated these agreements and has continually shot rockets at Israel throughout it. And the Israeli government is no longer interested in maintaining the status quo of fighting Hamas and letting them continue to go on. Israel has also made clear that they're not interested in taking over control of Gaza. That leaves the question, what would happen in Gaza after the war? Would Israel rebuild it? Would Arab countries? Who will run its governance? The official stance of Israel's ruling coalition, not necessarily the wartime coalition, is one that is opposed to a two-state solution. And Hamas, since the start of the current war, has communicated on multiple occasions they plan to invade Israel again and again. Additionally, the former Palestinian Authority president, who recently resigned, has said that the Palestinian Authority is no longer interested in controlling Gaza until Israel agrees to a two-state solution that would involve their demands regarding land secession. And finally, a two-state solution is still the official stance of the United States of America and the United Nations on a peaceful resolution to the conflict. To say the loss of life in both Israel and Gaza, as well as the West Bank, is a tragedy, is an understatement. It is sad that it keeps going on, and repeated wars between Israel and Hamas hint at the status quo working because, again, neither side is really looking for peace. And what can be seen through the multiple wars is that the actions of different Israeli governments, and a lens particularly focused on morality in terms of proportionality in regards to international humanitarian law, that there is a difference when the government is controlled by a left-wing party versus a right-wing party. Yeah, I think that's it. I tried to rush through it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an extremely, for all of us, extremely painful, painstaking time, and certainly in our own seminar, we struggled with that as well. So thank you for that paper. And Ben Perry, you're next with Zionism in Hebrew Literature, Poetry, and Prose, exploring Zionist ideas in gender, identity, and theology. And I believe you did this with Dr. Vered Weiss, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
My research, I'm examining Zionism in Hebrew literature, poetry, and prose. Thank you. And I will focus on the expression of Zionist ethos. I will contribute to the discussion of Zionism by considering how Hebrew literature portrays gender, religion, self-identity within a community and within the overall movement of cultural Zionism. To begin, in talking about Zionism, I must define what cultural Zionism is. And according to Dan Miron, in his academic paper, Hebrew Literature, Zionist Perspectives, and Israeli Realities, he claims that cultural Zionism is when Zionist writers are drawing upon the whole continuum of post-biblical sources, thus their language could resonate with a near infinity of associations and nuances. So whether that be a secular Jew or a religious Jew, a diasporic Jew, a Jew that just made an aliyah. So the point of cultural Zionism is to resonate with Jews across the world. One of the most intriguing Hebrew writers that I came across throughout this research was Bialik. He hailed from Odessa in Ukraine, and that was one of the major Jewish cultural centers of the early 1900s, and before Jews eventually made mass returns to Israel. And a lot of his poems that I talk about are kind of dark because they're in response to pogroms. So I kind of want to start it out with like a lighter poem that he wrote called Nad Ned, and it means seesaw. So like, and it's in reference to like a Talmudic line, what is up and what is down. So here you can clearly see that he's like pandering towards religious, ideas, and also, bringing it into the secular. For example, like in schools, they listen to this song. And so all the kids know Bialik in Israel. It's a major author over there. It's kind of similar to like what Dr. Seuss is, and being able to recite like some lines from some of his children's books. But most importantly, I want to talk about his response to the Kishinev pogrom in 1903 and how that played a very influential role in cultural Zionism. So in one of his poems called A Long Bow, he says, "The fruit has fallen, the flower is long forgotten, only leaves remain. One day a storm will rage and they will fall. Casualties to earth, afterwards terrible nights. No respite, no sleep. I wrestle alone in darkness, batter my head on the wall. Spring will blossom again, only I hang on to my stem. Bald shoot with no bud and no flower, no fruit and no leaf." In his poem, there's clearly many themes of just sadness and hopelessness going on. The hopeless imagery of a essentially dead plant with no flowers on it is furthered by his solitude of wrestling and grappling with the struggles of the pogrom alone. And I also found that this is an important metaphor that he makes of wrestling with himself alone, because it not only connects with the secular communities of Judaism who are struggling to come to terms with the pogroms, but he's also connecting with the religious Jews who will very easily understand his metaphor towards wrestling with an angel. Another poem that I found very profound from Bialik was called A Twig Alighted, and it's very similar to the one mentioned before. And I noticed stylistically with Bialik, he tends to repeat a lot of metaphors, and I think this is because he's struggling to articulate them, and he's going through many different thought patterns in trying to articulate these messages to his readers, more specifically Hebrew readers, and he's trying to bring in a wider range of audience, the whole culture of Judaism, not just a liturgic audience who's reading the holy language, but secular people who can connect with him as well. And he says, "A fruit has fallen, the flower is long forgotten, only leaves remain. One day a storm will rage and they will fall. Casualties to earth, afterwards terrible nights. No respite, no sleep. No sleep. I wrestle alone in darkness, batter my head on the wall. Spring will blossom again. Only I hang onto my stem, bald shoot with no bud and no flower." And I ask, who is dropping dead? Who is inflicting the pain of mental or physical smashing and wrestling upon oneself? And why is a bare plant so symbolic to Bialik? And I think that is because it is representative of his fear that his community may wither away. as if it's like a tree in the fall with leaves and going towards winter and all the leaves are falling. It symbolizes just, yeah, with the withering away of a community, something that he fears. In direct response to the Kishinev pogrom, he wrote, "In the City of Slaughter," and this is a long poem, and it's relatively dark in my opinion, and it evokes not only a lot of religious messages, but real apparent messages that anyone can kind of understand that was living through that time. A metaphor that he included was a dark Shekinah, and I thought that was important because he's talking about the ruins which were a result of the pogroms. And that's something that you don't really hear a lot in Judaism, a dark dwelling presence of God. That's not something that's very common. It's kind of taboo that he even mentioned that the divine could be dark, and it kind of instills a fear and a sense of worry amongst his readers, and even amongst myself, that you can include a paradox of this nature. And most importantly, not only is it a paradox that people are able to resonate to, but it's so close to the destruction of the temple, the ruins, the dark ruins. It evokes such a memory in a collective culture that people are bound to recognize and are forced to grapple with. Another poem he wrote in response to the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 was On the Slaughter. It's also has very similar metaphors to the poem aforementioned, but it's much more condensed. He says, "You executioner, here's my neck. Go to it, slaughter me, behead me like a dog. Yours is the almighty arm and the axe." And I found that he makes an interesting paradox here again, where he's calling his perpetrators almighty. He's telling them that they have an almighty arm, that they are the all-powerful. And that's something that Jews, in Jewish culture, we only associate with God. Only God can be the all-powerful, the all-knowing. And it's almost, I didn't think it was reductive towards God, but I thought it was almost as if he was putting the Jewish people on trial, saying, hey, how can you continue to live like this and then continue to say that there's this almighty who you believe is the all-powerful, while you sit here and you let your community kind of get decimated. Next, I want to discuss another poet. She was known as the poetess of Israel, Rachel the poet. She has a very interesting journey. So she came to Israel not by way of forced removal, but she was traveling there. And she fell in love with it. She grew up in Russia as well. She came from a very educated family. Her mother was very educated as well, which was very rare for the time being, the early 1900s. And why Rachel was so dynamic as a Hebrew poet is because she was one of the few women who is reading and writing and speaking this holy language that's only meant for very religious purposes, and she's bringing it into the secular, in which many can relate. Not many just Hebrew readers, but now because she's doing it, people in the secular community are more inclined to be part of the wider culture of Judaism and accepting the Hebrew language. Another point about Rachel was she fell in love with the kibbutz lifestyle in Israel, and she says in a documentary called The Hebrews Project, she says, "I came to the land of Israel to paint with a rake and write with a hoe." So she was very about the kibbutz life, and she wanted to make an impact no matter how big or how small. She wanted to be a part of the communal culture of what Eretz Israel had to offer. What I found very sad about Rachel, the poet's life, she did have a sad life. She came down with tuberculosis while she was living on the kibbutz, and she was forced to leave because she could no longer work and provide as a community member. And she writes a poem to her mother, her dead mother. Her mother died when she was 16. That's what led to her traveling to Israel and then falling in love with it. She says, "I have not sung you, my country, not brought glory to your name with the great deeds of a hero or the spoils of battle. But on the shores of the Jordan, my hands have planted a tree, and my feet have made a pathway through your fields. Modest are the gifts I bring you. I know this, mother. Modest I know the offerings of your daughter. Only an outburst of song on a day when the light flares up, only a silent tear for your poverty." And I thought this was a really special poem because it has a lot of messages in it, such as it seems like she's apologizing to her mother because, obviously her mother died when she was very young, and she was apologizing to her mother because she felt, almost that she lived an incomplete life in a way. But she's also making a remark, exclaiming that she made a very small impact on building the national home of the Jewish people, but it meant a lot to her. And for that, her mom should only be just a little bit sad, not terribly sad for her. And she found great meaning in her life, and through the struggles, she was able to continue to find meaning through struggle and through culture. Next, I want to talk about a poet, Leah Goldberg. And she was quite similar to Rachel. I thought she, conveys a message that balances the joys of life while also balancing the sadness, because as a poet, you cannot avoid either one of those. You have to go through the whole range of emotions, not only if you're talking about just an individual person, but especially an entire culture. And she says something very profound. She says, "Not writing in Hebrew would never do. It would be like not writing at all. Still, I want to be a writer. I see my whole future in it, my whole life. This is my one and only goal." So here you can clearly see that the cultural aspects of Zionism, the Hebrew language, is extremely important to her, and she finds great meaning in it because she can make religious metaphors if she wants, and she can connect with the secular if she wants. So it shows the dynamic ability that cultural Zionism has as an effect on the Jewish people. And Leah Goldberg, when she moved to Eretz Israel after the Nazis took power in Berlin in 1933, she joined the Yachdav group, which was a group of poets in Tel Aviv, similar to her, conveying ideas of cultural Zionism and trying to spread that message and its importance. And, just as a reflection on her as being an educated person, she was a school teacher at a Yemenite school in Tel Aviv. She writes another poem that's kind of similar in nature to Rachel, a poem to her mother, a poem to her family, and it's sad, but it's also happy at the same time. She says, "My mother's mother died in the spring of her days, and her daughter did not remember her face. Her image, engraved upon my grandfather's heart, was erased from the world of figures after his death. And I, her pale granddaughter, who do not resemble her, look into it today as if into a lake that hides its treasures beneath the water, and into the mirror carries on the family tradition that she was very beautiful." So clearly she's sad that, she was not similar to her mom or her grandmother. But at the same time, in the most simple way, just looking at a mirror, she still sees that reflection in herself of her family. And I think this is an important aspect of cultural Zionism because it emphasizes the importance of your ancestors and the wider range of Judaism outside of just yourself and how you relate to it, but how you relate to it and how those around you may relate to it. She also writes a poem about Tel Aviv because that's where she eventually settles down. How could the air of a small city support so many childhood memories, loves that were shed, that were stripped somewhere? Although this is, a one-liner poem, I thought this was extremely profound in terms of cultural Zionism because it acknowledges that diasporic Jews had to leave their homes, whether they were forced out of it or they fell in love with Eretz Israel, or it presented a better opportunity for them to work and live. And she acknowledges this sadness of leaving your diasporic home. Like when I read this, I can't really imagine or relate to having to leave my home. I think about it like if I had to leave Michigan and go somewhere else, like I would be, and for reasons that are forced, I would be extremely sad. There's such a profound memories and a core being to like where you're born and where you're from. So although they're going to the quote unquote national home, this is still a very hard journey and a sad journey. And she's saying like, how can this new city with not a lot of character at the time because it's brand new, how can this support things that are so profound as interpersonal relationships? And she kind of finds hopelessness in that. She's like, I came from a place of such character and such community, and now I'm going to this place that's new, and there's a lot of unfamiliarities, and the character still needs to be built up, but there's this there's a feeling of happiness as well, though, that she does acknowledge that even though the loves somewhere were shed, they will be acknowledged in what she says is Tel Aviv, and it gives great hope to cultural Zionism in its ability to unite Jews and strengthen the culture of Judaism. And that's it.
Meaningful, wonderful presentation. And last but not least, we have Ethan Biederman talking about Mayim Metukim, an analysis of Israeli water policy at home and abroad. And I think Dr. Kedem guided this project. So thank you so much, Ethan. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about Israeli water policy at home and abroad. As Dr. Aronoff said, in the face of climate change, access to water is becoming a really major issue. Mashav, which is Israel's foreign aid agency, estimates that 50% of the global population will lack access to drinkable water by 2030, which is in 6 years. The Middle East region, of course, where Israel is situated, is one of the most vulnerable places in the world to drought and to water access issues. So the policies that Israel takes towards water are going to become very important, both domestically and abroad, in the next coming years. So just to give a brief overview of my presentation today, I will first go through my research questions and methods before analyzing how Israel deals with water at home, and then transitioning to Israeli foreign aid, what that looks like, and then specifically the initiatives that Israel's taken to assist other countries with their water supply, and then comparing those methods and drawing a few conclusions. So in terms of research questions, these are them. I study international development. I'm going to get a master's in the field next year, so I wanted to look at how Israel made the transition from a developing country to a developed country and how it now engages in foreign aid, with what methods. And specifically looking at the issue of water, what methods it uses, which countries receive assistance, and then how does Israel actually gain the knowledge that it is then sharing with these countries? Where does that information come from? So I worked with Professor Kedem on this project. All of my research was done in Hebrew. All of my sources are in Hebrew. My final paper will be entirely in Hebrew. So This gave me a really unique insight into the specifics of Israeli policy. I was able to read news articles from Israeli newspapers and government reports from Mashav and from the Knesset as well. So all of this comes sort of directly from the source and translated by me. So moving now into how Israeli water policy functions at home, I want to illuminate this through the case study of the Dead Sea. You can see that the level of water in the Dead Sea has been decreasing for quite some time. It has decreased by 400 square kilometers from the 1930s to 2016. The level dropped about 1 meter per year, that's about 3 feet. And this is due to dam construction on the Jordan River and the Yarmouk River up north along the border towards Jordan and Syria. The dams are constructed to provide fresh water to people in Israel, in Jordan, in Syria, and it decreases the amount of water that is getting into the Dead Sea. This is having some serious environmental implications. Obviously, you can see just the change in water level, but beyond that, it is changing the ground surface. There's a decrease in groundwater level throughout the region that the Dead Sea is located in. There is the formation of these really dangerous sinkholes. There's an Israeli highway just on the western side of the Dead Sea that had to be relocated because of the sinkholes. And in addition to that, there are other damages to the ecosystem as a whole. So this is a serious environmental problem that Israel has to deal with. A solution that has been talked about for a really, really long time is a Dead Sea Canal. There's sort of 5 different routes that have been considered. When we talk about a Dead Sea Canal, it's really important to recognize the colonial roots of this project. It was first proposed by the British. They did not have control over this area yet. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, but they thought about the idea of constructing a canal to connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to create easier access to India. Obviously, they end up doing this in Egypt with the Suez Canal, but this sort of driving ideology behind this was that the Arab people who lived in this region were not civilized, they were not using the land efficiently, and so therefore it wouldn't be a big deal if the British came in, took the land from them, and built this canal. Obviously, the people who ruled this land at the time, the Ottomans, had some problems with this. They were very concerned about the implications of British power in the region if they were to construct a canal through this area. And then moving into the 20th century, there are also colonial ideologies behind a Zionist desire for this project. Zionists wanted to construct this canal to bring water for agricultural purposes throughout this area, and it again draws on the colonial ideology of the British that sort of the land is not being used appropriately, and so the thought was that this canal could help Zionist settlements change that and use the land appropriately for agriculture. Moving into the 21st century, there was finally some talk about actually making this happen. In 2005, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, and Israeli governments together requested the World Bank to conduct a feasibility study on this project. It was estimated to cost $16 million. In 2013, the 3 parties signed sort of a memorandum of understanding that this was going to happen and all of that. And then in 2015, Israel and Jordan reached an agreement on how this project would be managed. Of course, this has not been constructed yet, and I think the conversation around it has died down quite a bit. And the main reason for this is the efficacy of this program, right? The goal is to bring water into the Dead Sea, but the project would not actually be able to reverse what has already happened. At best, it would be able to maintain the water level. But aside from that, there are a number of really harmful environmental impacts. In the Dead Sea alone, the water appearance would change, the quality of the water would also change, and this is a very important, cultural tourist site. And to change the chemical makeup of the water and the appearance of the water would have a really grave effect on tourism for all 3 parties involved. But besides that, there would also be effects in the Red Sea. It's sort of predicted that coral reefs in the Red Sea would suffer from the construction of a canal, and fishing would be declined as well. And then the Arava Valley, which is this area sort of between the 2 seas, there would be damage to animals, plant life, groundwater, and surface water. All that would be contaminated with the salt water being brought from the Red Sea into the Dead Sea. So this is one of the many of the reasons why this canal has not yet been constructed. So another field of management that they're trying to do at the Arava Institute is sort of a non-governmental body that is working to preserve the Dead Sea as well. It's called Transboundary Water Management. You can see this map of the Dead Sea Basin, that the water going to the Dead Sea comes from many, many countries in the region. And for any solution to the problems that the Dead Sea faces, there's going to have to be coordination between all of these parties. So the Arava Institute tries to promote this communication and coordination between water professionals in all of these countries through knowledge sharing and the construction of long-term partnerships and relationships. Obviously, the geopolitical factors that are going on in the region sometimes hinder the ability of these people to work together and also for their recommendations to be adopted by the different governments involved. So now transitioning towards foreign assistance. As I said, Mashav is Israel's foreign aid agency. It's sort of the equivalent of USAID. It was founded in 1958 by David Ben-Gurion. It has its basis in both Jewish and secular values, which sort of reflects the philosophy of Israel at that time. So Tikkun Olam was a big ideological push behind the foundation of Mashav. It works across development fields, obviously in water assistance, but also in agriculture, education, public health, women's empowerment, community empowerment, all kinds of areas like that, and works with a variety of partners ranging from local organizations to big aid agencies like USAID or UN bodies, and they work all over the world to sort of further these development initiatives and to share Israeli knowledge. Of course, Mashav also has some really important geopolitical benefits by constructing these relationships and strengthening them between Israel and countries around the world. So before I highlight some of the water assistance that Israel does around the world, I want to illustrate how this sort of brings together to form my central thesis. What you'll see in the examples that I'm about to show you is that Israel has gained its knowledge about water management from its own practices. And it goes to these countries that have issues with water and spreads this knowledge, even if the tactics have not been successful in Israel. So it's very interesting that they learn from what they're experiencing, but recognize that maybe even if it didn't work in Israel, it could still work in other locations. So I'll highlight 4 examples briefly of water assistance by Mashav, starting with Panama. Obviously, Panama is known for the Panama Canal. It is fed by freshwater sources which are declining due to climate change. So the water level has dropped significantly, and this is preventing the canal from carrying as many ships as it used to. So Mashav, when they came into Panama, they sort of recommended a lot of changes in the water management and how wastewater was treated and things like that to help preserve the water level in Panama. Moving just north to the Bahamas, in 2019, there was a hurricane which flooded all of the groundwater sources with seawater, making it undrinkable. So Mashav assisted by building a remote desalination plant. Obviously, Israel is very proficient in desalination and was able to then remove the salt from the water and transport that to people who needed it in the Bahamas. In Africa, we can look at Botswana. There are issues there with the salinization of groundwater. The groundwater has salt in it. And so similarly, they have some desalination facilities that Mashav examined and made recommendations for improvement, again, drawing on the expertise of Israel in the field of desalination. And then finally is Lake Turkana. This is a lake that is on the border between Ethiopia and Kenya. Some of the issues there are, again, with salinity. There's a lot of issues with the entry of pollutants into the water, and the water level is also dropping. So Mashav has actually recommended transboundary water management to these countries, trying to establish a forum, even just as they have sort of tried to do with the Dead Sea. And they actually highlighted in their report that they discussed with the Ethiopian and Kenyan governments some of the successes that they've had with Dead Sea water management and some of the failures in trying to provide insight into how these two countries could make that work in their lake. So as I said, we can see some parallels between what Israel does at home and what it promotes abroad. Obviously, the big one is desalination. This is a desalination plant in Ashkelon. Obviously, it's a major source of water for Israelis. So this is an area that Israel is very proficient in terms of the technology and how to do this process efficiently. And so this is something that Mashav has promoted abroad in countries where there is issues with salt in the water. There's also promotion of transboundary water management, even though that method has not been extremely successful in Israel. However, what we can also see is that big infrastructure projects like the canal, for example, are something that Mashav is not promoting abroad. And we can see, you know, in Israel, this has been a contentious issue. It has not happened because of the environmental impacts. And so that is something that is not being promoted by Mashav because it has not been successful in Israel. So my primary two takeaways from this is that obviously Mashav is taking the knowledge from Israel, things that worked like desalination, and is promoting those techniques abroad to help other countries deal with salt issues in their water. But on the other hand, Mashav is also promoting some techniques like transboundary water management that have not been as successful at home, but still hold promise for other countries. So it's sort of this both and of what has worked but not, but trying to promote those things abroad and help these countries find success in their water management. So that's my presentation. These are my references, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And thank you to all three of the presentations. I think they all offer really interesting different aspects of different kinds of Zionisms over time and how they're different from each other, how they have evolved over time, and how they could potentially, in terms of, let's say, in this, that Adam brings up, in this current government, where you have versions of religious Zionism and versions of revisionist Zionism in this government, but also figures in the current government that would be considered anathema to certain previous versions of religious Zionism and other things, right? So we see that there's so much conversation today about Zionism and what it is and what it means and so forth, and we can see that there are so many different versions, and even within the different streams, right, there are a variety of different versions, and we can see Ben was just helping, I think, there you are, talking about cultural Zionism and the revitalization of the Hebrew language itself was kind of, we don't, I think, have a lot of precedents of that, of world history, of that happening to a language. And I know there's some indigenous communities who are trying to revitalize their languages, who are looking to that also as a model, as another expression of that stream. And then we have, with Ethan, a different kind of the practicality of whatever coalition government necessarily is in place at the time, a government like others who's using development and water desalination and so forth in order to both encounter kind of challenges and trade-offs with its own country, like you bring up with the Dead Sea, which you go there, and a lot of you who may have been there, you have these deep sinkholes with the water problem, but you mentioned the trade-offs of particular solutions to that, including possibly undermining my favorite snorkeling place in the world, which in Eilat in the Red Sea. Not that my preferences matter. And then you also discuss kind of its foreign aid program. So I think I'd have one question. I want to kind of leave it open for all of you. But before I do that, there was one thing I wanted to mention, is that in this panel there are also different aspects of what we consider Israel studies, right, as well. And you can use that vehicle, right, of that field to also look into some of the questions we were talking about in the earlier panels as well, in terms of expressions of political ideology, different orientations of religion, what does it mean, trade-offs and so forth within the particular state. But you can also look at it as a lens to look at much broader kind of questions around the world that we all tackle with, right? Which is the role of religion in the state in different countries, the role of different kinds of parliamentary democracy, the roles of different political cultures in the country continuously vying for what the identity of that country should be, the roles of different, foreign policy, the role of, cultural kind of expressions of what should express that national identity, right? As well as the environmental issues and dilemmas that come up that I know Ethan has looked at in India and other places around the world, and then doing a comparative analysis right through this lens of questions that are brought up in international development and how they play out in Israel as compared to other countries and in relation to other countries and how they impact, because I know you and I are major issues as well of having the environment address issues of how challenges can also influence conflicts, as well as how they can play a role in diplomacy and trying to resolve conflict. So it's also a lens through which to look at particular Jewish questions that we've been discussing all morning, but it's also a lens through which to look at kind of universal questions that we deal with in different disciplines and multiple disciplines and in different situations. So I'll ask one question to each of you, and then I'll open it up. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So first, with Adam, I think it's a really, and we've talked about this before, it's a really fascinating question to see to what extent there's continuity in terms of Israeli government. So like one hypothesis could be, it really matters a lot which political parties are in an Israeli coalition in terms of peace negotiations with Fatah and how urgently you try to pursue a two-state solution or whether you're against it. But one hypothesis is perhaps it matters less in dealing with Hamas and conflicts with Hamas than it does on these other issues, right? The portrayal is there's more consensus. So I think it's really interesting that you also bring up the question, well, how do the particular coalitions can affect and do they affect this? And it's really hard to disentangle how much of it is, there are multi-causal factors to everything. How much is it the gravity of what happened on October 7th? How much of it was kind of the humiliation of the government and defense forces that weren't able to prevent it and that wanted to prove themselves? How did that alter the goal? And how much is it kind of the particular coalition, right, that you talk about in terms of Netanyahu and his so I guess one question to you would be if you could maybe elaborate, and I'll give each of you the question, elaborate on to what extent it's kind of Netanyahu, right, from the start, who has been for several years now in legal battles over breach of trust, corruption, and so forth, to what extent his effort to stay out of jail, perhaps, and stay in power has influence over things. So that's one thing. But the second correlated thing, and we've talked about this, is what about other issues within the government that arise in this war? And one of those issues is whether you give priority to getting the hostages back or whether you get priority to trying to get rid of the military infrastructure as much as possible from Hamas. And there's so many internal divisions with that, even within the political parties and political ideologies. So I wanted to ask you about that. With Ben, when we get to Ben, I thought you did a beautiful job as well. And maybe you may not have delved as much into this, so that's fine. But the question that arises to me, and you did a beautiful job with your interpretations of the poems and so forth, is how are they then used as kind of national icons of kind of the new emerging Israeli state and culture, right? In state building processes, a state kind of builds what the curriculum should have in terms of these poems. And so why and how, what influence, and you may not know as much about this, but it's just something that maybe you can kind of think through or point to. And with Ethan, maybe I wanted you to give a chance to elaborate on to what extent, as I said, the initial question, it can kind of spur conflict, but also build bridges in trying to resolve conflicts in different ways. And one of the things that you probably didn't have time or, in the project itself or in the presentation to talk about is Israel selling water to Jordan from whom it had a peace treaty for, almost 30 years in exchange for other things from Jordan, and to what extent in increasing friction between those two countries that can play a role. And then the second Carly question is the wider question in terms of all the work that you've done on development and that I think you'll do in your career making this world a better place. What if you were going to make comparisons between USAID and the Israeli Foreign Assistance, what, if any, comparisons you can make in terms of the multiple motives of how the notion of development changes and how you do it on the ground changes, but also having kind of the diplomatic interest in increasing relations with the country. So we'll start with that, and then we'll open it up, and then we'll have some lunch that's awaiting us. So I think since you went first, I'll give it to you first, Adam.
So as with any government, really, the leader does have a lot of power over what that government does, and this can be seen with not just Netanyahu, but with Trump and the January 6th insurrection, where a lot of leaders, if they're I guess not in trouble, but if there's a lot of stuff building against them, they usually have these events where they lash out or encourage some sort of violence. So this happened here with Netanyahu, as there's a lot of hate against him right now because of the judicial upheaval, where now he has a lot of people marching against him outside of his home, and now being in a war, there is in any war there's usually a rally around the flag effect that the leaders are able to take advantage of. Then sorry, what was your second part of that question?
This internal contestation, even within political parties, sometimes as to whether give precedence among political parties in the coalition and the emergency government, but also sometimes within, as to do you give preferences to negotiating a deal for hostage release, or do you give preference for going after Hamas as much as possible? And there are those who interpret them as not being competing, right? And then there are those who interpret them as being very much in competition. So,
Yeah. So I would say there is a difference in general, even in the ruling coalition and then in the wartime coalition, between what they believe, whether or not they support a two-state solution, how to the level of which they do or whatnot. Whereas some parties want the entirety of the land to just be Israel, whereas some differ, and that's true of the ultra right-wing coalition too. As far as the hostages and their priority versus the priority of destroying Hamas, I think it really depends on which individual leader with it, or which each individual Knesset member. Whereas some will generally support I think all of them support the release of the hostages, but I think something gets more of a priority to destroy Hamas to prevent this happening again, whereas others, on the other hand, just want this to be over and want the hostages returned.
So your question was asking what makes these select poets the national poets.
how have they influenced it? Why were they chosen? How are they used? You might not be able to answer all those questions, but that's a question.
In terms of probably how they are chosen, I don't think they are necessarily chosen, but I think it's maybe the literary circles they were within and belong to, in the diaspora and in Eretz Israel. And I also think a big thing is their ability for readers to resonate with them. I think the metaphors that they use, and with Hebrew being a new language at the time, or not a new language, a revived language. I think the ones that had the most skill and I guess maybe swagger with bringing in metaphors, biblical, post-biblical, secular, that readers would be able to resonate with. And I think that's key in being a national poet. Just like any other country that has poets that are profound and speak on behalf of the people, the poets are able to resonate with the people. They're not kind of coming in from a perspective in which people don't or can't understand.
Okay, so in terms of, I think the government's importance in terms of aid, Mashav has under the current government, under Netanyahu, there's been a lot of cuts to Mashav. It's become less of a priority. And so I think that it really draws a contrast when you look at the foundation of Mashav in the 50s with Ben Gurion. It was very much based in both secular and Jewish values of we should help other people, and if we have knowledge, we should share it. And I think that that's something that maybe has become less of a priority as the government shifts ideologically to the right. It's just become less of a priority to be sharing that information. But I think Mashav is really interesting within the development field as a whole. Most agencies, USAID included, the way it works is non-governmental organizations or other partners apply for money. You propose an idea to USAID and say, oh, you want to deal with water issues in Botswana. Here's my idea. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's how I'm going to do it. And if they like it, they give you money. And so USAID acts more as a funder rather than an implementing agency. Whereas Mashav, it's a totally different approach. You don't apply for funding from Mashav. Mashav it's a government-directed project where teams are sent to spread knowledge. They also bring people from other countries into Israel to see desalination facilities, for example, and learn about them in Israel. So it's more of an education approach rather than a funding approach, which I think is very interesting amidst a lot of critiques of the development field as sort of a form of colonialism and a form of control through money. It's interesting to see this tactic of not through money but through education, and how does that sort of interact with the colonial ideologies that underpin development, and how, is it still a neocolonialist method of control if it's an education thing versus a money thing, and how does that impact the difference? So,
It's a real honor to see all of my students. All of you studied with me, took courses with me, so it's a real pleasure to see you all present together and about Israel. I'd like to ask you two questions to all of you that you can relate to your project, I think. One question is, what was surprising or new to you when you did this project that you didn't expect to learn from it? And then the second question is, how does that change, how doing these projects have changed your perception of Israel and of your relationship to Israel?
Who wants to go first?
So I think the most surprising thing that I learned about in the process of doing this wasn't even necessarily in relation to Israel. It was more in relation to the West Bank and Gaza, with the statistic on the amount of mistrust in the election system there. Just because I feel like there's a lot of research that goes into Palestinian support of Hamas or Fatah, but not support of the election. So it was interesting to see that, and to see the level of distrust that they really have in their own society against both parties. And then I think doing this project didn't really change my perception that much of Israel. I think it changed my perception a lot of asymmetrical war, and how the conflict between Israel and Hamas and broader in general with Palestine, how that works, because I think there's a lot of misinformation in general surrounding that conflict and surrounding both societies, and being able to look into it more using a lot of unbiased evidence that is not partisan made it impactful to me to learn a lot more about it, I guess, if that makes sense.
So for me, probably the most surprising and maybe intriguing thing that I learned over the course of my study with Professor Weiss was the fragmented experiences that various authors and poets had in terms of how I relate to Judaism and or Zionism. I was really only seeing it from my perspective of just being an American 22-year-old person in 2024. And, you hear, I guess, like messages that Bialik was saying, you kind of hear that, but I think in terms of like how the history is presented to you, but like when you're able to kind of dive into what he was saying and what others were saying and how they were able to weave in and out of like biblical references and contemporary secular references, I thought that was really neat and surprising, especially coming from the early 1900s, where I guess in my perception I thought it was more religiously focused, and I think it kind of re-emphasized to me the ideological diversity that is in Israel and the various experiences that people have and what brought them there, why they're there, who they are, why they are. So yeah, I think it was surprising to see the various experiences, not just one experience led to Aliyah, and then I think, it re-emphasized just how broad the ideological diversity is in Israel.
I think something that I was surprised to learn is sort of just the contradictions that exist in sort of the idea of Israel that we hold and what's actually happening a lot of the time. I remember I went to day school in Detroit. I remember there was always so much pride in the fact that Israel was always sending humanitarian aid when disasters would happen and was always helping other countries out when bad things happened. And then to do research and see that this is becoming less and less of priority when it's something that I remember like American Jews always taking such pride in, was just a really interesting contradiction to see. And then to see even within the policy of, well, this didn't work here, but let's try to get other people to do it anyway. I thought that was a really interesting contradiction to say, okay, well, if this technique doesn't work here, why are you promoting it? Why are you spending all this time and energy to, try to get other people to do this if it didn't work? So I think just like the contradictory nature of a lot of things was really interesting.
Thanks. Thank you all for really interesting, good papers. I actually just have a question for Ben, actually, which is that I was surprised. I don't know very much about Israeli culture at all, and I was really interested that there were two women who are sort of national poets, and I wonder that are sort of very foundational, and I wonder if you thought about gender at all, and they're talking about mothers and grandmothers, and so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you thought about how gender played a role in their elevation and the themes that they use, especially because I think I tend to think about Israeli culture as being more masculinist, like that's the impression that I've gotten from certain things, but yeah, so I'm curious if you thought about that or if you could talk about it.
In terms of cultural Zionism within poetry or poetry within cultural Zionism, I think gender definitely plays a huge role. Before cultural Zionism was kind of an accepted notion amongst the Jewish people, women were not widely known to be reading or allowed to be reading Hebrew and interacting with the language and, you know, debating in the language. This was something that was very unforeseen. I think this speaks a lot to the time period in which cultural Zionism came about, where like kind of liberalism and the effort of self-making was a huge part of the post-Enlightenment period. So I think it speaks volumes to the potential for Eretz Israel to have ideological diversity by including many different voices, not just a liturgical male voice, but now many different perspectives weaving together and sewing a language together to create new ideas and new perspectives.
Thank you so much to our presenters. I know to present in front of some people you don't know and outside the classroom is, I think, a great experience. And hopefully you felt like you're in a supportive environment, but still got pushed in different questions. And we really applaud you for the work that you've done and for presenting today. And we hope that you'll continue in your different stages to try to keep working on things, publish on things, and we're always here for you to support you and to mentor you through that. So I want to ask, actually, where should Jeff speak? Because we have a table there for lunch. I don't know if he can just speak there, or should he speak first and then we have lunch in terms of your live streaming? Or
either way, as
I.
long as he's presenting at the front.
Oh, so you'd still want him to present here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll leave it to Jeff. Would you like to maybe we'll hear from Jeff, because then it's hard once people eat to get them back and so forth. So he's just gonna give a shorter presentation, but it's a great connection after hearing from our students to hearing from a former student who's come back. And as I said, we have a lot of alumni that are willing to help our students, and so we'd like to bring in person as well and get your wisdom from your experiences. So maybe we'll share that and then we'll have lunch, because I think going
But I also wanted to highlight my message to you all, which is about finding your passion, finding your mentors, and finding your strengths, both here and beyond, and how that relates to my journey here at Michigan State and beyond. So it all started for me right here. It was so fitting. I literally lived in this building on 4 North 405 and 407 North Case Hall for 2 years, so 15 years ago in this building. Madison graduate IR class of 2011, and it was Jewish Studies specialization, they called them, for the minors. I also want to thank you for your fabulous presentations, which were very evocative of my own time here, both in terms of Joey's presentation and would make me recall just the great conversations I had with people involved in PTS, political theory majors, my best friend, and all the great conversations we had, even though theory is not my thing, kind of talking across those borders was a great way, talking about, talk about the practical policy issues, which was always on my mind in those days. And as well, of course, Adams. My first class with Yael Aronoff began in January of 2009, so during the first Gaza war. Went and looked on the calendar, and when in Olmer's final weeks around an Israeli election, my paper for my final course with her was on Gaza, so again, and all these other papers too, different courses and ways. So, I was here in Madison at MSU, but kind of who am I beyond that? We got a little bit, so I was here for my BA in International Relations. I went to a master's program in international studies. I'll touch on that later. Ultimately, I got a PhD from NYU in Jewish studies and history. So I'm a historian by training. I was in grad school until age 30. So, I had a postdoc at Harvard for a year, and then I've been assistant professor at Emory since 2020. So I was hired to teach about Israel. Most of my courses deal with Israel. Some of them deal with America, American Jews, American foreign policy as well, and you'll hear more about my book. So I actually came here, applied to MSU as a physics major. I came here, I think, for ADS, Alumni Distinguished, whatever, scholarship test exam. I don't know if they still do that. I think I was in this room maybe, and saw a seminar about James Madison College, which I didn't know about, and so I added a second major. But my freshman year, I took the physics courses, and I took courses with Eric Petrie and Saimei Ching and others, and I found myself, even though I did totally fine in my physics courses, I wanted to become a patent lawyer, which seemed practical and definitely more lucrative. But I found myself outside of class, even though I would have been fine as a physics major, an engineer, or whatever I wanted to be, I found my interest, and what I was reading about outside of class had to do with international relations, politics, and so ultimately I dropped the second major and focused on IR. So I really followed what I wanted to do rather than what I thought I should do. That really was a major decision in my life and trajectory, and I don't think it was the wrong one. And again, that's following your passions, following your interests. And kind of one of the takeaways is this, that you'll do well in the things that you're passionate about, and maybe you're not going to shine as much in things that are only semi-interesting to you. So I actually didn't intend to focus on the Middle East or Israel or Jewish studies. I already came in with a background having gone to a Jewish high school in the Chicago area. But I was involved in Hillel stuff. I was 15. Later I became president of the Jewish Student Union, and I went to college with Robin Huey, and I know Cindy, and I know all the Jewish infrastructure of MSU life. But my first trip anywhere outside the country was, when I was 18 after freshman year, a trip to Israel, free trip to Israel. I would have taken a free trip anywhere, but kind of because the opportunities that presented to myself, here's photos, image quality from digital photos back then, not quite the same. I was interested in all these different parts of the world. I took classes, with Professor Edozi, who's been gone for a while, and Professor Ching, and I was interested, do I want to do something with Asia or Africa? But I just had this sort of tie-in. I had these experiences going to Israel, and of course, I had the experience, life-changing experience of taking courses with Professor Aronoff. The first one was Israeli politics. I found the syllabus of the second one. I remember when I took my second course with her, I think I was already had some of my Madison requirements, and we like changed things so I could take a third course with her, and it would count toward the major. And so she sort of really kind of roped me in. So it was building on my interests, building on my strengths. And I had these sort of multiple courses of the Middle East that, again, I hadn't really gone into. But if I'd had a mentor who was doing, Japan or South Africa, maybe I would have been sucked in somewhere differently. But of course, with all the resources that were available and all of the, mentorship, that was very sort of important in my trajectory. So in my junior year, again, getting my third class, there's a senior seminar on Israeli foreign policy. I don't know if you still do that one. I teach a similar course myself now. Gaza was on our minds back then. Sometimes it is more and less. I know Professor Aronoff had written her own article on Sharon and recent prime ministers. I got really interested on sort of the public diplomacy of the optics, in a way, of Israel's disengagement from the Gaza Strip, which had happened 5 years earlier. So I wrote for that class a senior seminar paper on the disengagement. I was told, I remember sitting in Professor Aronoff's office, I was told it was very good, which is really important because, if you're not encouraged and told that your work is good, how do you know? And I was encouraged to submit it to an academic journal, and I did, and it was rejected from Israel Studies Review. But I submitted again, and it was accepted the second time. So it's very unusual to have sort of an undergraduate paper that came out a few years later, in 2014, in an academic journal. And it just so happened around that time that Ariel Sharon passed away, and I even kind of wrote a piece that got published, kind of his obituary in the Atlantic. This is again after Undergraduate, on him that connected, drew from my research. And so again, finding your mentorship, finding your own strengths, finding people who encourage you is so important. Another lesson I took away from this is that if you try to do something, often no one will stop you. I didn't need to you can submit something, you can start your own initiative, and maybe you won't succeed, but if you think you have something that one of your mentors or you think is going to be published in the Atlantic or can be published somewhere, or have an idea for a group, just try doing it. And if you're not investing vast amounts of money or time, there's limits to what you can lose out on that. So I was still thinking I'd go into law school. I didn't know what I was doing. Let's see. Yeah. Going in my senior year, I'll get to that in a minute. But I actually decided for my study abroad. Usually, I went for my spring of my senior year, that I would go to Israel, to Haifa, and so in spring 2011. Here I am traveling from Israel to see another fellow Spartan, Eric Ranoff, in Jordan. Again, at Haifa, part of the reason I went to Israel is because, again, there were these resources from various fellowships. Again, sort of very important. So my senior year, so that's, 13 years ago. Senior year, like many Madison students and many of my own students, I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? The economy was not so great in 2010, if people recall. But do I go for a job? I applied for jobs. I got an interview with a consulting firm that was, again, would have been lucrative. I took it to LSAT. I applied to law school. I thought, okay, that's something stable. I can, live, okay from that. I got into law schools, including Emory, which is where I now teach. And I also applied to international affairs programs, so public policy focused master's programs, which, by the way, I really feel like MSU, and I mean James Madison College, is like the perfect kind of transition into a program like that, like almost like a MA in SIPA or SICE or Johns Hopkins, all these sort of top international development or international affairs programs. There's not a lot of places that prepare you as well, I think, for a program like that than there. I applied to 20 graduate programs between law and masters, lots of letters of recommendation, so thank you for that. And then that's not 2 years later, I applied to PhD programs, another 10. And I ended up, I was in Israel getting these letters back from my, checking the time, these letters back from these programs. And back then, like the Wi-Fi was bad at the Haifa dorms, and like checking the email, like my parents calling me because some of these places still did like letters, and getting into law schools, getting into master's programs. But this was 2011, spring 2011, and so I'm deciding law school, master's in international relations. Arab Spring's happening. Like there's revolutions in countries, and it's just like so exciting and interesting, being abroad. I'd really only been to Israel, and one of the master's programs I got into was through Johns Hopkins, a top international relations program where half the students, including me, spend their first year in Bologna, Italy. So, okay, go to law school or go to Italy and study what I'm really interested in. And so, again, like I kind of pushed off physics, I also pushed off law school. I'm sure I would have been totally fine. And, in some ways have a more, academia is not easy, or a lot of paths in these fields are not easy or straightforward. But I went sort of to follow what I thought I'd be good at and what I was interested in. Because if you're not interested and passionate in something, you're not going to be doing your best. So I thought I was going to get into government type work from there, but I kind of was afraid of maybe having to work for a government that's policies I didn't agree with at some point, which probably would have been the case considering, election a few years later. And so I decided it was kind of a complicated story for me. I was at Hopkins political science PhD program, which wasn't a great fit for a bit, and then went to NYU. I decided to go into history and Jewish studies. I wasn't so interested in theory or political science, and so I knew they had a great Israel studies center within their Jewish studies program. You could do history as well. So 2 years after finishing at MSU, I spent my last semester at MSU in Haifa. Then I was in Australia for an internship, and then I was in Bologna for a year, and then I studied Arabic in Morocco, and then I was in Baltimore for a year, and then I'm there at NYU, and I'm very interested in like diplomatic history, at first, coming from the IR sort of background, like maybe U.S.-Israel relations is what I applied to do, but I ended up finding sources that were very interesting. If you missed my talk last night, I hear it's going to be on YouTube, so I won't go into the details of that, but I thought history would be a much more interesting way for me to engage in what I wanted to do. And I found sources that weren't in the field quite of diplomatic history. Some of them had related more to Jewish, American Jewish history, living in New York and finding stuff online. And I really wrote a dissertation that sort of dealt with American Jews and Israel and Palestinian rights issues. That wasn't what I planned to write a dissertation on, but was just sort of, I followed the sources that I thought were interesting and figured out a way how to make a dissertation, later a book out of it, that's been interesting to other people. Instead of feeling like, oh, I have to do it on this that I came in to do, it was that. So I know this is a research a conference, so methodologically, I had to undergo a shift. We do at Madison, we are some historians, but a lot of people who are sort of interdisciplinary, But historians, we deal with primary sources, often archives, going in and looking at musty old pieces of paper. So I spent my years of graduate school in New York and Israel, other places throughout the US, looking at musty documents and piecing together a story that I found interesting and that I hoped others would. So in the middle of this in 2017, first I was TAing at NYU, and then I got hired by Rutgers. Funny enough, where Professor Enoff's father taught for a long time. They actually teach their Israeli politics course. So as a graduate student, I looked at Professor Enoff's old syllabus and revamped it and made it my own, but still had a modified version of the simulation. And so I taught my first course at Rutgers, which was later the first course I taught at Emory when I got that job. So, the dissertation I finished in 2019, and then I kind of revised it into a book, which is its own little process, which came out in November, pictured here. It's on Amazon, it's on audiobook, ebook, so if you're interested, that's that. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to end, some of the challenges of now and just how this all relates to that very hard year for many people in this room, especially those of us who teach about Israel, those of us who have family in Israel or friends from Gaza, all sorts of backgrounds it's been hard for. But I think a lot of the tools I engaged in, a lot of these philosophies I'm talking about were kind of relevant in that. And so, after October, when you're in this major crisis teaching about Israel to students of diverse backgrounds, it's like, what can I do? What can I what is my purpose in this? And really kind of thinking about my interests, my role, what roles can I play in students and public discourse? And so that, again, has been kind of something that's been pretty driving in terms of figuring out how to get through this and also help others. What can I do best in terms of vis-a-vis me versus others, and what can only I do given the positionality that I have during a challenging time. So so I guess just go back to how I started. Finding your passions and interest is very important, because you're not going to work as hard or intensely at something that you're not interested in. I tell this to my students when they're writing papers, if you're writing a paper that's not interesting to you, it's not going to be interesting to me or your readers. And so, you're not going to get into it as much. It's just not going to be as good. So first and foremost, I give students leeway and tell them to follow your own stuff. So that applies to research, that applies to anything you're communicating about. It's going to do better at something that's keeping you up at night in terms of your excitement and interest in it. Now's the time, both if you're 19 or 22 or even 23, 24 after college, to figure out what that is, what's interesting to you in college, just to engage within classroom and beyond. These are the lower stakes years. I think at 21, 22, I see my juniors and seniors being, I need to know what I'm doing next. And it really doesn't matter what you're doing when you're 22, 23. You can always course correct later. It's a very low stakes period. So take your time to sort of think, okay, do I really want to go to law school? Do I really want to work in this field? Because it'll only become harder to course correct later. So just engage intellectually, find your mentors, because you need to know, you might be interested in something, but are you great at it? And finding someone in your field to say, oh, you should talk to this, you should apply to this program, oh, you're a little bit better at this than that. That's important, because not everything you're interested in is necessarily what you excel at, but there are aspects of that. Okay, maybe you're not, fit for career X, but what's really close to that is career Y, which your skills, is also connected to this, and someone who's a mentor, whether it's a professor or your aunt's friend who works in a field of interest, can be someone you have conversations about. So these conversations, whether they're professors or other mentors, can be very valuable. So really take advantage of those. So from there you'll find your strengths. You'll find your purpose, you'll find your successes, because again, you need to find stuff that's going to drive you to do the things that you need to do, whether it's going through musty boxes in archive or doing the many other types of work that people do. So do I have another slide? Oh, of course, bring it back here. Again, this building, such an important place for me for intellectual growth in terms of finding out what I wanted to do in a career. So I urge you all to make the most of your time here, your engagement with faculty, your engagement with the interesting people around you, and engagement with fun, which is never difficult for Spartans to find. So thank you all, and let's eat.